Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Trevin Locke. I'm Assistant Research Director here at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's public meeting, Advancing in Representative Enrollment in Clinical Trials, which is being convened by us here at Duke Margolis. Need to note up front that support for this event has been provided by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The views expressed here today do not necessarily reflect the views of the foundation, but we thank them again for their support of this work. During today's virtual meeting, we will have 3 sessions with panel remarks and moderated discussion covering a wide range of topics related to challenges to achieving representative enrollment in clinical trials and resources and policies needed to support more widespread adoption of these efforts across the broader stakeholder community. We will hear perspectives from across the clinical trial spectrum, including regulators, industry sponsors, community engagement experts, patient advocates, and more. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a few considerations for discussion and some basic housekeeping notes. Next slide. As always, at our events here at Duke Margolis, we like to have a short note about our commitment to academic independence. We do not take partisan positions, but encourage participants to freely speak their minds and express opinions on important issues. You can find more about our policies by following these links on the slides. Next slide. I'm sure we're all Zoom meeting expert pros at this point, but just a few usual participation instruction reminders. The meeting materials for this meeting are on our website. You can find the agenda and a brief background document there. Within the next few days, a recording of the meeting and the slides that you see here today will be up on that same event webpage on the Duke Margolis website. Throughout the event today, please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A box to ask your questions. We'll be referencing that throughout the day's events. Please be aware that we expect a lot of you to be joining us today, and so we might not be able to get to every audience question, but we'll do our best to cover as many as possible. We are joined today by a group of subject matter experts that you can see on the agenda, and we're very excited to have all of them with us and all of you in the audience with us as well. Lastly, please email Luke and at the email you see here on the slide if for some reason you have any Zoom issues or with accessing the webinar meeting today. Next slide. So I'll quickly provide an agenda overview. We are going to start with a short presentation from me. I'll provide an overview of our work here at Margolis the past few months around representation in clinical trials. And do a little level setting on terminology we'll be using and goals for the entire meeting. We'll then have our first panel that is going to be around defining the current clinical trial landscape, discussing some challenges in achieving representative trial enrollment, how we can measure representation goals, and a little bit about the current policy and regulatory landscape surrounding this topic of trial representation. Our second panel will focus on the resources needed to build capacity for representative enrollment and the role of education and community partnerships in building that capacity in community settings. We're then excited to have a fireside chat with Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, the editor-in-chief at JAMA and chair of the National Academy's 2022 report on improving representation in clinical trials and research. She'll be joining Dr. Mark McClellan, the director here at the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. For our last panel of the day, we'll be discussing the roles of various stakeholders in improving trial representation with one last great panel lineup. And then we'll close around 4. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'm going to dive right in to kind of our level setting opening presentation, starting with why we here. I'm sure many of you joining already have your own answers to this question. From our perspective, as we've thought about this work, we've recognized that many clinical trials are affected by structural and systemic complexities that can result in the failure to address important research questions efficiently and equitably. There's a growing impetus to reimagine trial conduct, and while doing so to improve trial representation, while not compromising vital research standards. Importantly, without adequate trial representation, it is difficult to generate generalizable clinical research findings, which ultimately means representative trials are good science and contribute to the development of clinically meaningful medical products and ensuring the acceptability of those new products by the broader public once they are approved and in use. Next slide. So what exactly is the problem? Again, I'm sure this is not news to many of you attending, but to quickly kind of lay out some figures. Overall, non-Hispanic white patients are grossly overrepresented in clinical trials. According to some recent data from FDA, 75% of trial participants were white. The report from the National Academies last year showed little progress in most areas in enrolling underrepresented racial and ethnic patient populations. Likewise, there are continued challenges in terms of geography, socioeconomic status, age, gender, and other representation in clinical research in vital categories that are important for the efficient delivery of care and use of medical products. One model suggests with a more economic bent that if just 1% of these health disparities were improved by better representation in clinical trials, there'd be potential for billions of dollars in gains for high impact diseases here in this country through addressing issues around reduced life expectancy and more working years and things like that. And of course, it goes without saying that the benefits we see here are not just monetary. You know, we're talking about leveraging more representation in clinical research to close persistent gaps in life expectancy and ultimately provide better care for more people. Next slide. You'll hear us today primarily discussing representation or representativeness rather than diversity. And some of you might view that as a bit of a semantics question. For us, I think in our framing, we see as a bit more than that. Our goal, which seems to increasingly align with the broader conversation we see in this space, is not, you know, a simple numbers game of hitting diversity targets and checking a box, but rather ensuring that the clinical trial enterprise as a whole and the way that it intersects with the health system as a whole is truly representative of real-world disease burden and enables the best clinical care possible. As I said, this encompasses race and ethnicity, of course, but also geography, age, socioeconomic status, social determinants of health, and gender, sexual orientation and gender identity as well. With that being said, it's important to note that an equitable clinical research infrastructure should be comprised of trials and studies that accurately match demographics of the disease burden under study. With the caveat that it's important to acknowledge that the disease burden as quantified in the literature available data is not always reflective of the actual disease burden because of you know, historic and current structural racism and discrimination, limiting our ability to truly understand the impact of at least some disease areas. Next slide. This has been an active space. As many of you probably know, from Congress to FDA to elsewhere, there's been a lot of activity over the past few years, just a few of which are noted here on this slide. The federal government and Congress passed new legislation at the end of the year, giving FDA new mandates and authorities to require diversity action plans for their trials, which FDA was already working on prior to this legislation. Meanwhile, other research foundations are starting to set standards and requirements to encourage representativeness. A few years ago, Congress passed the Clinical Trial Treatment Act, requiring state Medicaid programs to cover routine costs with clinical trials. As noted last year, the National Academies released their report with some clear recommendations. Just earlier this spring, our colleagues at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative released their recommendations for improving diversity in clinical trials and a corresponding maturity model. And across the space, from sponsors to payers to journals to other stakeholders, many of which you'll hear from today, have engaged in voluntary efforts to increase trial representation. This is just a snapshot. If you go to our webpage for this event, you'll see in the background document a much larger, but still not exhaustive list of material from organizations represented in today's meeting and others that are working on various topics in this vein. So hopefully, after the meeting today, you'll have plenty of reading material for the rest of your summer. Next slide. What about us? So here at Margolis, we've been working on this topic in earnest since the later part of last year, starting with a landscape review of kind of a lot of the activities I just mentioned, into a series of stakeholder interviews this spring, which brings us now to this meeting, where you'll hear a little bit about the considerations that have emerged during our early part of this work. But I should note that the topics covered today are not meant to be all-encompassing or representative of definitive solutions. We recognize that this is a complex space with a myriad of perspectives. So we're trying to hone in today on a few areas that we think discussion is most valuable and where we can most think about actionable steps and opportunities for accountability and action moving forward. The publication here in the middle of the arrow is going to be informed by all of this work I just described, including insights we hear today at this event, which will translate into our second half of this project that'll be ongoing through the early part of next year. Next slide. So now I'm going to run through quickly just a few, again, not necessarily an exhaustive list of the themes that have come out of our work that we expect to be a major part of the discussion here at the event today. The first of these is measurement considerations for assessing trial representativeness. As I alluded to earlier, prevalence rates, while a better baseline and census percentages may not be a wholly accurate representation of disease burden, but likely still a strong spot to start. Should also noting that race and ethnicity are flawed and often poorly collected variables that are at best surrogates for deeper characteristics we're trying to measure. There's a need for improved measurement across the board to make sure we're able to track how well we're doing, but also to make sure we're truly being representative and equitable of the broader real world population and not merely trying to check boxes. With that in mind, stakeholders need to work toward widespread adoption and consistency in benchmarks used to evaluate representation and align on those metrics, not just here in the States, but also internationally in the global trial enterprise as well. Next slide. Another barrier that'll come up quite a bit in our session 2 is barriers, but also opportunities and sustainable community and patient engagement. Our historic and to large of an extent, our current health system and research practices often discourage trial participation in many of the groups that we were talking about. It's critical that researchers and sponsors establish ongoing relationships with organizations in the community and really get their feedback, gauge community needs and ultimately build sustainable research networks, not kind of one and done approaches. Trial sponsors and researchers should make more overt efforts to align the funding they provide for clinical trials with the goal of providing broader benefits for participants, and should also consider how to sustainably engage in the community, whether that's knowledge sharing or health related programs or infrastructure more broadly. Next slide. Another piece of this is modernizing our clinical trial approach in general through pragmatic design approaches. These trials can in many ways be more flexible and accommodating to patients in traditional trials, giving potential participants the ability to take place in where they normally receive care and in more community settings and away from the major academic centers. This can reduce the amount of resources that patients need to participate in trials, reduce travel time, ideally reduce visits, leverage their existing relationships with providers they trust, and hopefully kind of increase their comfort in being part of the research process through that. Next slide. And of course, wouldn't be a health policy meeting without some thought around policies. So the last theme that we think will be highlighted today is around the importance of formal policies, from regulatory agencies to funders to research institutions. We think there's a lot of opportunity to implement clearer rules and regulations to ensure that representation is not an afterthought in clinical trials. We've seen promising steps toward this and actions by FDA in particular, but also others around diversity action plans. But we'll also touch on today what funders such as NIH and private funders might do, the potential role of journal policies in publishing articles based off clinical trial research, and approaches to funding structures that make it easier to engage at the community and patient level. Now, again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of the issues facing this representativeness conversation, but we expect these four will make up the bulk of our discussion today. Next slide. Before we get into session one proper, I'm going to have just a few more slides connecting this conversation to a broader work here at Duke-Margolis. So we, along with many other collaborators, have some ongoing work around advancing what we call point-of-care trials as one component of building a modern clinical trial enterprise and improving our ability to generate practically relevant evidence more efficiently. We believe that integrating clinical research into clinical care through these trials may provide a means of solving some of the barriers resulting in low representation in clinical trials, chiefly through providing increased access to clinical research where people receive care, and hopefully increasing patient comfort. Throughout our conversations today, therefore, you'll hear conversations around point-of-care trials to help us consider their potential role in addressing issues related to trial representation. This is a relatively new approach to clinical research that has just a handful of use cases out there. And so there's a lot of opportunity for input to shape future trial design. As our thinking and as clinical research evolves in this direction, it's critical that we keep representation at the forefront. And if out of this meeting, we are able to have good conversations about placing point-of-care trials in a broader approach to ensuring representativeness in clinical research, that will be very successful from our point of view. Next slide. What exactly are point-of-care trials? Briefly, they're an operational approach to data collection, integrating clinical research into routine care. Chiefly, that looks like integrating key trial operations from screening to consent to randomization and data collection into the electronic health records already being used for normal care visits between a provider and their patient. In the ideal scenario, trial conduct is conducted without significant differentiation for the patient experience. So they just are visiting their doctor as normal. And then that is supported by well-integrated workflows between the care and research side. We think successfully executed, these trials have the potential to simplify conduct of trials, lower costs, and improve generalizability of the generated evidence by increasing access to clinical research for more real-world populations, while eliminating the need for larger scale single-use trial infrastructure. Next slide. But it is important to acknowledge that while trial approaches like these may have a role in improving representativeness overall of clinical trial cohorts, meaningful, sustainable change may be difficult given that the clinical trial enterprise as a whole is heavily impacted by and in some ways helps maintain some of the larger structural and societal problems coming from systemic racism and other issues. So as we think about this, it's important again, to avoid recruitmentology tactics and again, trying to just play a numbers game and not truly go for equitable approaches, rather, getting dangerously close to exploiting subjects to narrow the gap between groups. So again, to be avoided there. And should also note, and I suspect this will come out in some of our conversations today, there are systemic barriers to access around lack of insurance, transportation, resources, et cetera, as well as limited staff with the capability to translate or create materials in a bilingual, bicultural manner on clinical trials. And so all of this will continue to be a concern for trial participation and retention, kind of regardless of the specific trial approach. So ultimately, to create longstanding and sustainable partnerships across sectors and stakeholders, we're going to have to do a better job of aligning where funding comes from, aligning who has decision-making power, and issues such as that moving forward. And so I think with that, that's our setup for the day. And so now I'm excited to get us going into our first session, defining current clinical trial landscape. In this session, our panel of experts are going to describe some current challenges to achieving representative trial enrollment, picking up off that opening presentation, discuss approaches to measuring success in achieving trial representation goals, and talk a little bit about the impact of the current policy regulatory landscape and where progress has been made in recent years. I would like to begin by introducing our speakers and panelists. Dr. Jen Meller is an associate professor at the Yale School of Medicine, director of the Good Pharma Scorecard, and founder of the nonprofit Bioethics International. Dr. Lola Fashoyan-Ajay is deputy division director and associate director at the Oncology Center of Excellence at the Food and Drug Administration. And Sneha Dave is founder and executive director at Generation Patient. So we're going to hear from all of these shortly, but first, I would like to pass it over to Dr. Jen Meller, who will discuss some of her work around measuring clinical trial representativeness and associated considerations. So Jen, over to you. I believe you're muted.
Thanks, Trevin, for the generous introduction and the opportunity to present a few thoughts today. So as Trevin mentioned, my name is Jennifer Miller. I'm an associate professor at Yale School of Medicine, founder of the nonprofit Bioethics International, and director of the Good Pharma Scorecard, which is a subject of today's talk. Next slide. So what is the Good Pharma Scorecard? It's an index designed to rate and rank biopharmaceutical companies on their bioethics and social responsibility performance annually, with research conducted by investigators at Stanford University and Yale School of Medicine, and results disseminated in partnership with Scientific American. Next slide. The Good Pharma Scorecard, like most scorecards rating and ranking initiatives, aims to do three key things. One, educate and raise awareness around bioethics issues and concerns, and importantly, set and communicate clear bioethics goals and metrics for a sector. And then to use those metrics to track progress over time on goals and recognize best practices to show that it's possible to do better. And most importantly, catalyze better behaviors where needed. Next slide. So we decided to tackle improving diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in clinical research for three key reasons. As you can see, the Good Pharma Scorecard is designed to look comprehensively at many bioethics issues, and today I'll just drill down into this one section. Next slide. So the three key reasons we decided to address diversity in clinical trials are: first, countless studies have shown substantial lack of diversity in clinical trial enrollment. Women, older adults, racial and ethnic minoritized patients are consistently underrepresented in research. We tend to test our new medicines and vaccines on patients who are younger, healthier, and more likely to identify as white and male than patients in US clinical settings. Next slide. Policy efforts to improve both demographic reporting and representation in research, while extensive and spanning greater than 40 years, have had limited impact. For example, you can see in 1998, the FDA issued the demographic rule requiring new drug applications to present safety and effectiveness data across sex, age, and racial subgroups. And more recently, as Trevin mentioned, FDORA was signed into law by President Biden on December 29th in 2022, newly requiring sponsors to submit diversity action plans to the FDA for pivotal trials that outline and justify trial enrollment goals by age, sex, race, and ethnicity. And they should also provide details on how sponsors plan to meet those enrollment goals. Next slide. And importantly, a lack of diversity in clinical trial enrollment represents a public health and social justice concern. So as a group of us wrote in the Journal of Medical Ethics in April of 2022, and countless others have as well, including Dr. Schwartz in New England Journal of Medicine this year, there are substantial concerns around the generalizability of trial results for underrepresented groups and fair opportunities for underrepresented groups to participate in and access trials. And unrepresentative research also runs the risk of exacerbating distrust in medicine and novel products. For example, a recent study found that racially underrepresented patients and the clinicians who treat them are less likely to believe a drug will be effective for them, to find trial evidence relevant to their care, and are less likely to use and prescribe medicines when trial samples are not representative. Interestingly, when the evidence base is more racially representative, these gaps close. Next slide. So the first step that we had to do to add the measures to the Good Pharma Scorecard was to conceptualize or define what constitutes adequate diversity in clinical and trial enrollment. Next slide. So in reviewing the literature, you will see that there are two key ways to conceptualize adequate representation. You can take a country population approach or a condition-based approach. The country population approach suggests that trial participants belonging to a specific demographic group should be enrolled in proportion to a country's population, proportions of the population who lie within that demographic group. So for the US, this would mean that around 50.5% of trial participants should be female, 13.6% identify as Black, and the like for all trials, regardless of a trial's indication. So the country population approach is disease neutral. You can see on the screen an example of this. It was used by Doctors Milena Lolik and Janet Woodcock and colleagues to assess the adequacy of racial and ethnic representation in US clinical trials supporting FDA approval of new drugs and biologics from 2015 to 2019. In contrast, the condition-based approach suggests trial participant demographics should mirror those of the patient population in a given country with the study's targeted condition. An early adopter of this method was Dr. Rita Poon when she was at the FDA, and she used it to benchmark the adequacy of female participation in late-stage clinical trials supporting approval of new drugs and biologics from 2007 to 2009. So you can see that a lot of people have been measuring clinical trial diversity over the decades. For the Good Pharma Scorecard, we opted to use the latter approach, the condition-based approach. Next slide. So through the Good Pharma Scorecard, we look at three categories of DEIA measures for clinical research. The first one is transparency. We assess whether researchers and sponsors publicly report trial participant demographics. Then we look at representation, assess whether trial participant demographics adequately represent the US patient population with the studied condition, calculated by constructing a participation to prevalence ratio. And then we look at a composite fair inclusion measure, which is the average of transparency and representation scores. We are focused on an arguably narrow set of demographic subgroups, women and older adult participants, along with 5 minimum designations for race and 2 designations for ethnicity, in keeping with FDA guidance for industry and FDA staff on the collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials published in October 26 of 2016. Next slide. So for transparency, we're looking at data in clinicaltrials.gov and publications. We want to see that clinicaltrials.gov results reporting or publications contain a demographic breakdown of trial participants. For representation, we then add a few more samples of data sources, including FDA approval packages available on drugs at FDA snapshots, and product labels. For cancer incidence data, we're looking at the US Cancer Statistics Dataset, which is a cancer registry data from the National Program of Cancer Registries, along with SEER data. We also look at American Cancer Society's Cancer Facts and Figures. Next slide. So what did we find when we piloted the measures on a sample of products? So our sample consisted of novel drugs and biologics approved by the FDA between 2012 and 2017. And here what you'll see is that the FDA approved 59 novel oncology products, 39 drugs, and 20 biologics, all of which were sponsored by industry, 25 unique pharma companies. For 16 broad oncologic indications, the therapeutics were approved based on 64 total pivotal trials that collectively enrolled about 30,000 patients. Each pivotal trial had a median of about 326 participants, and the median number of pivotal trials supporting approval of each product was one trial. So what did we find? On the next slide, you'll see that overall, we found a substantial underreporting and underrepresentation for most demographic groups. So if you start with looking at the trial level first, which is your first vertical column, you'll see that while 100% of pivotal trials disclose the sex of trial participants, only about 2/3 disclose the age and percentage of older adult participants. And then when you look at race and ethnicity, only 41% of pivotal trials disclosed the racial and ethnic identity of trial participants. And here we were just focused on patients identifying as Black, Latino, Asian, and white. In terms of representation, remaining on the trial level, you'll see that 81% of trials adequately represented women, less than a quarter older adults, about a quarter of older adults, and 10% for racial and ethnic minoritized patients. And then when you take a fair inclusion view, which is that were trials both transparent and representative about demographic participants, you'll see that 81% of pivotal trials fairly included women, 23% older adults, and 5% racial and ethnic minoritized patients. If you move to the company level and you look at the fair inclusion scores, you'll see that 54% of pharmaceutical companies that we evaluated fairly included women in all their pivotal trials supporting their product approvals, 20% older adults, and only 4% racial and ethnic minoritized patients. Next slide. So looking more granularly into the data, you'll find that while greater than 80% of trials had researchers that reported the number of patients identifying as white, Black, or Asian, only 45% of trials had transparent reporting about the number of patients identifying as Latino, and less than 20% disclose the number of participants identifying as Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, Alaska Native, or American Indian. Next slide. So interestingly, by company, you can see a wide range of practices. Next slide. And one company up at the top, United Therapeutics. United Therapeutics trial was a collaboration with NCI, National Cancer Institute, which was really interesting. It was one of the few, or if not the only one, in this sample. And there are 7 other companies in the top 25% bracket in our evaluations, suggesting that it is possible to do better, to get things right. So now we're conducting studies to understand how positive deviant sponsors, leaders in clinical trial transparency were able to achieve high levels of representation in their research. Next slide. So there are a couple of hypotheses about why things don't look better. One that was floating out there was that post-marketing studies might be more transparent and representative under this assumption that pre-market trials, there might be a rush to prioritize broad access with an intent and get FDA approval with the intent of gathering more specific demographic information post-approval of their product. Unfortunately, that is not what we found. We found post-marketing trials, all things considered, to be less representative and less transparent for demographic groups than pre-marketing trials. Next slide. Next slide. And so another concern was that, maybe our data was old and too retrospective looking, because the initial pilot focused on products approved between 2012 and 2017. And it was highly possible that things were getting better between, for 2018 to 2021 or 2022 product approvals. So this is some forthcoming work that we have drafted. And here you can see that in general, for most demographic groups, we're not seeing a statistically significant improvement in representation, except for perhaps for Latino patients. And in fact, for females, transparency is going down. Next slide. So here's where, as a researcher, I step back and I say, this doesn't look good. What can we do to improve things, particularly when policy efforts and private sector efforts are coming up short? And so this is why we're going to try and use the Good Pharma Scorecard, which has been effective in reforming other bioethics issues. Studies show that rating and ranking can improve behaviors. Perhaps the strongest empirical study on this subject was done by Aaron Chatterjee and Michael Toffel, published in the Journal of Strategic Management in 2010. They reviewed 600 firms subject to environmental rankings and determined that environmental ranking systems are indeed an effective quality improvement strategy, particularly for low scoring companies. And our own studies have found something similar. Next slide. Benchmarking data sharing of pharmaceutical companies. We give pharmaceutical companies a 30-day amendment window to fix things, and we publish a pre and post score. And here you can see that in the 2019 data sharing analysis and rankings, about 50% of the low scoring large companies improved their practices within that 30-day amendment window. So we're hoping to do something similar to measurably move the needle for patients. Next slide. And we think that the Good Pharma Scorecard might be a good vehicle to do this because it has widespread adoption by large pharma companies. And here you can just see a few of the annual reports and CEO letters and communications by companies sort of highlighting when they score well on measures. Next slide. To be sure, the measures that I just mentioned are riddled with limitations, many of which have to do with the limitations of our publicly available cancer incidence data, which arguably is much more robust than the incidence data we have for other conditions and diseases. In some senses, the cancer incidence data is a best case scenario. Here, I'll just name two limitations with the incidence data. Patient demographic data are mainly available for broad cancer types. In contrast, most or many therapeutics target very specific cancer types. So, for example, the SEER database has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma included and breaks down the demographics of patients, but it doesn't include mantle cell lymphoma. And the products in our sample, a couple of them were for mantle cell lymphoma, which is a type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but it's not. This doesn't have the same impact across demographics. Mantle cell lymphoma more often affects men compared with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, 75% versus 55%. Frequently, the incidence data is missing some race and ethnicity information. For example, we couldn't construct a participation to prevalence ratio for Asian patients with neuroblastoma because demographic data were unavailable in the US cancer statistics. Furthermore, as Trevin already mentioned, the US cancer statistics data set and the American Cancer Society data can include inaccuracies owing from the fact that underserved minority populations within the US can have lower screening, diagnosis, and access rates to cancer care. Further, it's very hard to disaggregate trial enrollment by country using public data sources. So we looked at all trials, all patients enrolled in a participant, regardless of whether they were based in the US or other countries. And our previous research has shown that novel drugs are tested in a median of 26 different countries. So wrapping up with the next slide. Our findings have implications. They suggest that oncology researchers are far from implementing baseline reporting and representation recommendations contained in policy and professional ethical guidance. And it's actually 0% of our trials that we have reviewed now over the last 10 decade of approvals met all of our measures, let alone more comprehensive recommendations contained in, for example, the Office of Management and Budget, Directive 15, which suggests demographic reporting should include far more dimensions than we're analyzing, ranging from primary language to disability status. And the new FDA guidance published in December of 2022 also recommends that diversity efforts attend to participant residency location, gender identity, socioeconomic status, and non-demographic populations characteristics, including organ dysfunction, comorbid conditions, and those at the extremes of weight ranges. While we haven't seen significant improvements in demographic reporting or representation for most groups over the last decade, I remain hopeful for this coming decade. The new FDA draft guidance published in April, coupled with Fedora 2023, and the efforts by so many of us on this call and in this meeting can and should help bend the arc towards greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, and access in oncology research. So thank you, Trevin and Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy for organizing this important meeting and helping connect, amplify, and operationalize all of our efforts to advance patient centricity, justice, and equity in medicine. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jen, for that great presentation. As we transition to our other panelists, I will go ahead and put a plug to the audience to start dropping your questions into the Zoom Q&A feature. We'll be getting to those shortly. But first, I'm excited to turn it over to our other two panelists for this session to share a bit about their work and their perspectives on the current state of clinical trial representation and ongoing efforts to improve it. First, I'll go to Lola.
Good afternoon. Thank you for, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. I think, you know, I am very hopeful that we will be in the next several years be making some positive strides towards ensuring that our clinical study population reflects the diversity of the population with the condition that is under investigation in the clinical studies. I do think that it is really important to set expectations that are grounded in sort of the reality of the fact that we are unlikely to see really the effects of many of the efforts that are currently underway for many, many years. But I do think that there are some kind of low-hanging, immediately effective strategies that can be implemented to drive what I think we're all hoping to do which is to ensure exactly what I just described in terms of representativeness. And that really includes, you know, changing the way that we talk about representativeness in clinical studies, and also the way we strategize and design our studies and our trials to be more thoughtful about both the clinical aspects, but also the operational aspects of conducting really inclusive and representative research. And so I'm very excited to be part of this panel and hopefully share some perspectives, including the regulatory perspective on this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola. Sneha, over to you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Sneha Dave. I am the executive director at Generation Patient, and we are a nonprofit representing adolescents and young adults with chronic and rare conditions. We're entirely young adult patient-led, and we have focus areas in increasing access to higher education, peer support, and health policy, where we're specifically very much looking at increasing the understanding and representation of adolescents and young adults in clinical trials. Just to give you a little bit of an overview, over half of young adults in the United States now live with a chronic condition. And we feel like for a lot of our community across diseases, we've been aggregated with adults over the age of 18. So a lot of trials will report 18 to 64. But when we're thinking about young adults who are over the age of 18, but not necessarily 50 or 60-year-olds, that's very concerning to us. And we really do believe that oncology, the adolescent young adult, which I'll call AYA, oncology space has really led the way for defining a lot of AYA cancers as having a distinct epidemiology. And we believe that this should be extended to other disease areas, such as inflammatory bowel disease, where the peak onset of IBD is now in adolescence. And so when we're thinking about diversity and specifically age and the intersections that come about with age, it's really critical for us to think about how we can enable a greater consensus of what really adolescents and young adults, what this age group is. Again, AYA cancers typically define this as 15 to 39, but we are still a little bit unclear on how that could be extended to other disease groups. An example of the sort of lack of consensus and opportunity to be able to clarify this age group is with the fact when we're looking at adverse event reporting systems, for example, with FAERS, FDA's adverse event reporting system, young adults have been aggregated to 18 to 64 with narrower age ranges before and after. But when we're looking at CDCs, for example, we see 18 to 29, a lot more reasonable subgroups in our opinion. And then when we look at SEERS for NCI, there's a lot even better stratifications of what age can entail. So I think, again, when we're thinking about diversity in clinical trials, we really want to ensure that the intersectionality is represented and that we're thinking more intentionally about young adults who often have not been well represented and advocated for within the trial space, at least for a lot of the common chronic disease areas. Thanks.
Now I'm muted. So thank you. Jen, I'll welcome you back on video as well, and we'll dive in. We'll briefly throw up some discussion questions for the session today, maybe more than we can get through in the next a half hour or so, but we'll also start pulling in some audience questions as well. So maybe I'll start with thinking, maybe Jen, and I'll start with you, but welcome anyone chiming in. As we think about the work of the Good Farmer Scorecard and kind of tracking progress and improvements, like what more can we do as a broader community to align on representation metrics that are kind of useful across the board and policies to support them? Is it collecting better data? Is it just more support to collect data? Does anything stand out as kind of a big gap in the availability of information to even kind of create metrics like yours, Jen?
Yeah, well, I think Sneha was sort of also hinting at it, right? That our incidence and prevalence data for many conditions and diseases is publicly less robust than some of the private data sets or not available, right, in the level of detail that we need. So I think publicly available incidence and prevalence data sets would be really important that include other information about demographic information about patients. And then, you know, the Good Farmer Scorecard, it's such a toe in the water, right? It's such a humble way to sort of try and get at what we really need, which is systemic changes to address the barriers to clinical trial participation, right? As we all know, we tend to test new medicines and vaccines in large academic medical centers in cities near the coasts in the US. So there are rural urban gaps in community hospital versus academic medical center gaps in trial access. That requires some infrastructure building. And as Lola mentioned, there's like a lot of other challenges, right? Language barriers, transportation barriers, elder care, childcare barriers. So all of these sort of processes and system changes need to take place And then I agree with Lola. We'll probably see changes, a little bit later down the road as it takes time to redirect the infrastructure.
Does anyone else want to add on to that?
I can comment on that. I think one of the critical things with this question is to include patient voices, but I also think really understanding where patient voices are coming from. I think as someone who leads a patient advocacy group, I don't know if we're always the best people to go to for people with lived experience in terms of thinking about those who are the most underrepresented within trials. So I think patient advocacy groups are a really, really great start to be able to build consensus and understanding of lived experience. But I would just really, really caution that not all patient advocacy groups are equal and not all of them are, driven by the community. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about who we're engaging and how we're engaging different stakeholders. The other thing I would say is really, and I think Jen has already highlighted this, but I'll just add on to disaggregate data to make it more publicly available. We have wanted to do so many different studies with some of the researchers that we work with that really look at age within certain therapeutics. And we have just really struggled to be able to capture more subgrouped data. And I think, as the public, we definitely deserve this data and we definitely need it a little bit easier so that we're able to do our own research if we can't rely on private industry to do that. And I think the last thing, which is a bit unrelated, is that when we're thinking about, and I think Jen was mentioning this across different areas that we're engaging patients and thinking about where we're really meeting patients where there are in terms of communication, et cetera, there's a huge cultural component even across ages. So I know in our community, there's a lot of undisclosed, drug and alcohol use that a lot of patients, for example, just don't feel comfortable engaging in a clinical trial because they don't want to open up those conversations. And so when we're thinking about, again, how we're communicating with patients, who we're communicating with to try to understand the real barriers beyond just the superficial, it's really important. So I don't know if I think that was tangential to your question, but just made me think of it.
No, that's great. Thank you. So maybe shifting gears a little bit, Lola, I'll go to you. I know we're still relatively early in the implementation of diversity plans, but maybe do you want to speak a little bit to kind of how those conversations are going, or any challenges emerging? I know we didn't intentionally design this session around oncology, but oncology keeps coming up as kind of the area with the most progress here. So and I think you're seeing that in the diversity plans too, but maybe you can also share a bit about how we might expand the great work that the oncology area with help from the Oncology Center of Excellence has started to make progress in other disease areas as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that as with anything that's new or early in its kind of implementation and focus, there's a need really for culture change. I think that's kind of one of the biggest barriers in typically in implementing new policy is sort of kind of redirecting an approach that has been ongoing for decades in clinical research to be more thoughtful about the participants who are actually included in the clinical study. So I think that there's obviously, I think, a lot of activity that's ongoing, both within the federal, the regulatory agencies, FDA being one of them, but also across industry, who are all mobilizing their teams to try to meet FDA's expectations for more representative clinical research, but also to meet the requirements of new mandates, as you discussed earlier. And so I do think that probably the biggest challenge, if I had to name one, is really in sort of rethinking the way that things are being done, but also in challenging ourselves to reconsider assumptions that we've held for a very, very long time about really what it takes to be more inclusive in our approach. But also, the concerns that often get raised around, quality of the data, quality of the research, and timelines to the clinical study, and delays to completion and access to drugs. I think that a lot of those assumptions often can be informed by very little data to support those assumptions, and I think that they get sort of I don't want to say exaggerated, but they really take a much larger center stage in sort of people's inclination to kind of adopt a new policy. So I do think that a lot of the experience that we have at FDA is within oncology with respect to implementing diversity plans and receiving them and reviewing them. And I think that, our early experience really shows kind of a real great variability in terms of where sponsors are in thinking about diversity and representativeness as a clinical matter, as a scientific matter, rather than just kind of a general policy issue that does not have clinical implications. Diversity plans occur in the context of a clinical study, and therefore the issues to be addressed there are clinical ones, and so I think that there's that shift in the thinking that is can be a barrier. And we described sort of where sponsors' current efforts and practices are with respect to this issue in a recent publication published in the Journal of Clinical Cancer Research. And I think that, if your audience is interested, I think that there's a real clear indication of interest on the part of industry to change. But I do think that there are some real challenges that are challenges that occur even beyond just the specific clinical study. I think that's the end product of a lot of other issues that may or may not be within the purview of the respective stakeholders to address. And so I do think that context is important, but at the end of the day, the most important metric, right, is not, did you try, did you not try, but really is, how did it end up? Like what did the clinical trial, whom did the clinical trial enroll, and what kind of evidence did we generate? And is that evidence generalizable to the population with the disease or the condition? That's where, I think we want to see measurable change. But there are some other ways, other metrics that the various stakeholders can undertake in terms of, how much is our internal policy really emphasizing and focusing this issue? How much are we sort of coupling our trials that our staff who are experts in diversity and inclusion with those who are working in clinical development, in clinical operations? I think those are metrics that sponsors are probably best suited to address, but I think those are important metrics, even though they don't necessarily, you don't see that in terms of the clinical trial, but I think those will be the important early metrics for progress to be looked at. And then I think regulators are also accountable for this issue. So, how often are we emphasizing this as part of our ongoing feedback to sponsors in the clinical development process? It could be also a very important metric to see whether on both sides we are equally prioritizing this issue.
Thanks so much. I want to go to a question from the audience, but Jen, I saw you briefly raise your hand. Did you want to jump in?
Oh, yeah, I found it So, well, I was hanging on to every word that you said, because in designing the Good Pharma Scorecard, we thought, should we just look at outcome, which is what you sort of said, like the most important thing is not whether you had a commitment and tried, but did you get there, right? And so we started with the outcome. Did you get there? Did you conduct transparent and representative research? But I'm really thinking we also need the processes in place as well. And so, rooms, if we were going to add more metrics, or other groups were going to look at metrics, we might want to think about looking at sponsors' publicly available trial diversity policies and sort of what is in that public policy commitment. Other things are, and so there's some robust policies out there that pharma companies have that have commitments to things like using broad eligibility criteria in protocols. So we don't unnecessarily exclude patients with certain comorbidities or polypharmacy and things like that. Commitments to workforce diversity, to incorporate patient input early into product development, to conduct community outreach, to increase awareness about trial opportunities and health literacy, and things like that. So I think, we tend to focus on these outcome measures, but, it's worth discussing whether there should be some process measures in the interim of everybody scoring 100%, which we hope happens, or in addition.
Thanks. So going to a few audience questions, and I think Lola, this comes off from your remarks. Can you share if there's any plans by the agency to share or summarize at least a subset of diversity action plans coming to the FDA to help kind of others learn what's working and what's not? Obviously, with the question even says without any confidential information redacted, but some sort of resource to kind of help as people try these plans out.
Yes, the short answer is yes. We are working on that. I do want to clarify that, we are currently receiving diversity plans, which are very much aligned with our current draft guidance on diversity plans for race and ethnicity. So we are not yet receiving diversity action plans, which we have not yet defined in guidance. So it's a kind of a semantic thing, but I just want to be very clear that we are not currently receiving diversity action plans. We are receiving diversity plans, and we do plan to publish on that shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions thinking about the rare disease lens. So particularly for rare disease trials where prevalence or incidence rates are not accurately captured. Are there any special kind of considerations to aim for diversity and representation when you're already dealing with an already small patient population?
Well, I guess I just want to make sure I understand the question. Is the question whether it's important to enroll a representative population for a rare disease? Is that the question?
I think it's how do we do that when even the entire population is a small number?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that diversity is about increasing the number of patients that you need to conduct a clinical study. I think it's really about doing the best that we can to ensure that the population enrolled in the study is going to yield results in the clinical, is going to permit the clinical study results to be generalizable to the larger population with the rare disease. And I think many of the efforts and measures that are undertaken to ensure the inclusion of historically underrepresented populations in clinical study will actually aid in the identification and recruitment of patients with rare diseases. So I think it will overall increase the number of patients who are available to be included in clinical studies. So I don't see those issues in terms of there being tension between the two, because what are we talking about? We're talking about, rational selection of inclusion and exclusion criteria, ensuring that they're based on, sound scientific rationale. We're talking about, decreasing the burden to clinical studies, to ensure that patients with, fewer resources can participate in the clinical studies. We're talking about addressing transportation barriers, geographic barriers. These are the types of things that we are discussing when we are trying to, meet some goals for representativeness. And I don't see those things being counter to the goals of enrolling a rare disease population.
Say hi, Jen. Any thoughts to add to that?
It was hard to understand exactly the root of that question, but if in a very simplistic way, it was just asking, what do you do if you don't have incidence and prevalence data for the rare disease? A fallback strategy could be that you aim to mimic the US population. It's the best fallback strategy for a target, enrollment target, and you'd have to justify it. You'd say we don't know the incidence and prevalence data across demographic groups, and therefore for US FDA approval, we're going to aim for these targets. I mean, the FDA would have to tell you whether that's reasonable from an ethics perspective. It would seem justifiable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when we talk about diversity, we're talking about many different things. I mean, there's demographic diversity, there's clinical diversity, right? And so they may be in certain settings where the focus is on some particular aspect of diversity that's critical. We see differences in enrollment by sex, we see differences in enrollment by age groups, and even within kind of the pediatric populations, we may see under enrollment of very young patients when maybe it's appropriate to enroll them in a more representative fashion. So I would not get so fixated on whether or not, the goals of diversity are will slow down or will be unattainable in the context of a rare disease clinical development program, because I think in many ways it actually will facilitate better enrollment and to generate better data that we don't have that many chances, right, to do these studies in rare disease populations. So why not optimize the one attempt that you have by ensuring that you are getting every patient for whom it would be safe to participate in the clinical study, because you are addressing really barriers that have nothing to do with the disease or the drug itself. So I do think that those things are do not oppose each other.
No, yeah, thank you all. I think this leads well into some other questions that we're getting about kind of balancing the needs and expectations here in the US with kind of the more global approach to trials, whether that's rare disease or something else entirely. We know that many trials are conducted on the global scale these days. So as we're thinking about how to be representative of the US, and Sneha, maybe this is kind of relevant as we think about young adults as well. How do we balance kind of the global nature of trials with the needs to be representative of the US population?
Is that to the whole group or
whoever wants to jump in? I know it's not an easy question.
Well, I mean, I don't know that it's a particularly challenging question, to be quite honest. It's a very clear question. I think that, what we're looking for here isn't perfection, right? We're looking for us to take advantage of every opportunity to be more inclusive in our research to do that. We are also looking for a thoughtful approach to selecting the types of patients whom will permit or facilitate generalizability of study results and applicability of those study results to the US population. I represent the US FDA. I do not represent a global regulatory agency. And so I think if you look at some of the newer legislation that's come out, it's very US centric. Now, does that mean that, we are not interested in global equity? No, it does not mean that. Does that mean that we have stuck our heads in the sand and pretend that there clinical studies aren't global. No, it does not mean that. But I think that if you were to disaggregate the current clinical trial data by geographic location, US versus non-US, you will find that even within the population enrolled in the United States, the disparities in terms of enrollment are not very different than when you consider the overall. So it's not an issue of, global versus US. It's really about, are you being very thoughtful about how you are getting patients in the clinical study? I don't think that there's magic to this. And I think we get caught up in, well, does Black mean the same in the US versus in Brazil? Does, who's white in North Africa versus, in the US? And I think that these things are distractions because, there's a very different sociopolitical milieu in the US compared to in other parts of the world. That's just a reality. And, where we can harmonize things, I think we try to do that. But I think it's also reasonable to not expect to be completely harmonized across the board, including for those things that are quite unique to the US. And so I think we don't have a problem calling the disparities. I think Jen just presented a bunch of data showing you exactly who is not in the clinical studies. So I think the focus should be on getting those people in the clinical studies and not sort of kind of being caught up in these discussions about hypotheticals. I think that there's some real hard work to be done. And I think these conversations about, harmony and should it be this, should it be that, they just actually are not very productive. And so I do think that it's important to recognize that, we do try to be harmonized, but there are also times when we are not even, and that's okay because we don't have the same needs across the board. There's some societies where, the patient voice is not included in the clinical development program or even in the clinical care. And we have a very different society here in the US. And so I do think that there are some characteristics that are unique to the locale that cannot and should not be completely erased just for the sake of convenience here. There's a lot of work to be done with how we do research, even within the United States. And I would focus on that.
Thanks, Lola. Jen, it looks like you might want to.
Yeah, I mean, I sympathize with the question because there are concerns about whether clinical trial data extrapolates across geographic locations. So the big question is, how do you pick your clinical trial sites? And you can start with a very high level, sort of thinking about regions, across the globe, countries, and then within the country, right, inter and intra-country site selections. And, there is an argument to situate your trials in countries with the highest disease burden, right? But for you, and there might be a tension between advancing U.S. health equity goals and global health equity goals, especially given how small our current pivotal trials are, right? If there's only a median of 326 patients enrolled and they're across 26 different countries, that's pretty small numbers per country. So yeah, there's not enough work in this area of how to balance U.S. health equity goals with global health equity goals and within the context of pre-market trials.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to go off that. I don't have an exact answer to the question, but I know specifically for age, I think there's a lot that we can learn from our European counterparts, especially for a lot of RCTs that have been done specific to adolescents and young adults. And I think the way that age is looked at in Europe, not to generalize, is a little bit more intentional, in my opinion, than the way that we look at it here in the United States. And I would also point to the fact that it's really exciting to see that the FDA has done guidances on pediatrics and thinking about age and the Tanner stages of development rather than chronological age, for example. But I think that that's something that could be learned from our European counterparts in particular. And there's a lot of really interesting RCTs that have been led in the context of Europe for adolescents and young adults.
That's a great flag. Thank you. And I might go to you, Sneha, for the next question too, to start at least. We have a question about leveraging more, I'm going to call it real data, although the question doesn't. So looking at improving representativeness through observational studies, the availability of natural history data, registries, things like that. Is that something that you and your group have looked into for helping increase the availability of information on young adults and young adult specific disease questions?
Yeah, I think this has been more so done in the pediatric space and for at least what we've been thinking about, but there is a registry called CREATES, which I think a lot of people might be familiar with, which has been really slow to get started because of how underfunded it is. And I think that just speaks to the whole challenge of pediatric clinical trials in general. But I think one of the areas that's really, really difficult is getting, as a patient group, is getting buy-in from private industry as well as regulatory agencies and philanthropy, et cetera. And so it's really, really difficult, especially when we're thinking about disease-specific issues that have traditionally not been thought to affect younger populations, but actually we're seeing do more and more. So I think this is kind of probably an obvious answer, but a huge issue is when we're thinking about funding and getting the right partners on board. But it is really exciting because especially if we're looking at younger populations, the opportunity to create a registry allows for a lot more robust long-term data, which is really exciting, especially if we're starting at the peds level. And it is pretty remarkable to think that for a lot of therapeutics that specifically look at inflammatory bowel disease, though we don't focus on a specific disease area, we don't have any really robust registries for pediatric IBD when we're thinking about long-term safety and efficacy of particular therapeutics. So I think the buy-in is really difficult. And we also just have to acknowledge that a lot of patient advocacy groups are burdened with having to be the conveners of these registries and data sets. And I think that there needs to be a lot more recognition that, patient advocacy groups, especially those that are led by smaller patient advocacy groups that are patient-led and care partner-led, often don't have the capacity to lead this, but very much are interested in doing so.
Thank you. Lola, Jen, any thoughts on leveraging real evidence sources? And I might kind of segue this into our next question too. Jen, your presentation indicated that post-market studies are actually even worse than pre-market. So does anyone want to comment on how we might use post-marketing requirements or better approach enhancing representativeness in the post-market setting? I know there's been a lot of talk that I've heard about, if say diversity plan goals aren't hit in the pre-market, approaching it and kind of closing that gap in the post-market. But Jen, based off your work, it seems like that might not be as easily a given as some people might think. So does anyone want to comment on that and how we might close that gap?
Yeah, that was really disappointing when we found that post-marketing studies are generally less transparent and representative than the pre-market studies. But I will say, from an ethics perspective, it gives me pause to sort of suggest that we can allow pre-market studies to continue to lack representation, and that's what we'll use post-marketing studies for, whether they're observational or not. Because in a sense, what that says is we're prioritizing certain groups for early access to data, and others we're sort of saying you have to wait. Right. And that for me is a red flag. So it'd be better. Ideally, it would be better to do much earlier in the development phase, which the FDA guidelines are emphasizing.
Yeah, I think it goes back again to my earlier comments about really planning at the outset, and we highlighted this also in our paper, diversity doesn't just happen. I think that there are many clinical sites that are situated in predominantly minoritized communities and or communities, with populations that are historically underrepresented in clinical research, and they don't make it into the clinical study. So you have to really be very intentional, whether it's in the pre-market setting or the post-market setting. It's not just going to happen. And so if there is a sort of laissez-faire, approach to diversity in the pre-market and post-market setting, you're not going to get better results just because it's post-approval now. I do think that there needs to be intentionality across the board, and I think that we have to really weigh I think once you implement measures that help to bring more patients into the clinical study, we should not see discrepancies really even in the pre-market setting versus the post-market setting. Now, that's not to say that besides, despite one's best efforts, we're always going to meet the goals that we set out for. And that can occur in the pre-market and post-market setting, to be quite honest. But I think that our goal is really that that every study enrolls a representative population. I don't think that we are prioritizing diversity over, early access or vice versa. I think it should be considered all the time, prospectively, intentionally, and I think implemented across the board from clinical development to operations to post-market and so forth.
Thank you all. I'm checking my clock here and getting warned that we're close to time. So I'm gonna, I think, turn it all to you one more time to share. I'll let you pick either the biggest need for further progress in this space, or the kind of recent activity that makes you most encouraged that we're seeing some change and advancement here.
I'm happy to go.
Yeah, please.
I think we outlined in the paper that I referenced again in the Cancer Clinical Research Journal, really what are important steps to take, what current barriers are, and what are opportunities to work together to solve some of those issues. I think that transparency in activities, transparency in the strategies that are being implemented, and in the results that are observed is really critical. And I think that also critical is the importance of sharing information and not being duplicative, really leveraging each other's work to the extent that we can to move forward rather than just to kind of redo what has already been done. There are many strategies, as I'm sure you'll hear later on today, that are already have been shown to be quite effective. But what is disappointing to me sometimes is to see people sort of say, well, we need to figure out how to address diversity. And it's and I think that starting, just because you are starting from the beginning doesn't mean that the effort should be starting from the beginning. There's so much that has been learned over time about what may work. It just hasn't been the uptake for those kinds of strategies just haven't been as large scale as they need to be reflected in the clinical studies that we evaluate. So I would say, transparency and sharing and leveraging, and also really important is changing the tone of the conversation that sort of hits diversity and inclusion against kind of meeting timelines, against, quality data, against this and that, like all these other priorities that we've determined are more important. I think that's unfortunate and really not productive. And I think it's also really important to be kind of in in problem solving mode rather than just to be in kind of, let's figure out what all the problems are. I think that that kind of keeps us exactly where we are. And it makes us kind of we're just kind of brainstorming of all the problems mode, and we're just not moving forward whatsoever. I think that that is problematic. And then I think the last thing I will say is that, again, we're not looking for perfection. I think we're looking for a commonality in the way we discuss and develop plans, implement plans. And we want sponsors to be thinking about what is reasonable, what makes sense in the spirit of being inclusive and enrolling a representative population. So, and discussing with the FDA frequently and, frequently, early and frequently is always a good approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Lola. Sneha, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, really quickly, I think, I know we're running out of time, but I think one thing I will just say is it will be really, really great to have more public data. Also, when we're thinking about the diversity action plans that come out, I think it's fine. This is probably a little bit of a different opinion, but I think the public should be able to have access to even data that's quote unquote academic in confidence, not necessarily commercial in confidence, because it really allows us as the public to be able to analyze, who's been included and how that has been done. So I think public reporting is super, super important for patient groups and groups like ours. And the second thing is that I've already mentioned this, but we really need to have a global consensus on adolescents and young adults. Again, over 85% of those with childhood conditions are now surviving past the age of 12 and past adolescence now. And so our systems are dealing with a whole new influx of a generation of patients that we really need to account for within diseases that do affect our age demographic in particular.
Thank you. Jen, last word.
Well, Sneha and Lola said everything they said, and I think it's really important that we focus on at least 4 levels of action. One, like Lola said, the ethical persuasion piece, right? That it's really important to prioritize representation of demographic groups and among other variables in clinical research, as much as other priorities that might be trumping this to date. So work on the level of ethical persuasion, that the policies have to be right on the sponsor level. So in my case, I focus on pharma companies. So what does a good policy commitment look like? That can be a real lever for change. And then the procedures to implement the policy, right? Whether it's a commitment to using broader clinical trial inclusion and exclusion criteria where appropriate, to diversifying the workforce, and including the patient voice earlier in research and development and trial design. So ethical persuasion, policies, procedures, and lastly, looking at the outcomes, right? Did all of that lead to the outcomes we want to see? And then I might say that I'd also think about what we owe patients and communities who partner with sponsors, right? We call patients partners in drug development. And it's problematic to do that. And then if patients and the partners can't access the products that they help develop, right? And so, for example, when we test drugs in non-high income countries, they don't always get submitted for regulatory approval and approved in those countries for commercial access. So, just say we need good clinical trial enrollment, representative clinical trial enrollment, and then also fair access to the products.
Thank you. And thank you all again so much for great conversation and great thoughts. Really appreciate your time today. To everyone else, we're going to be going now to a 10-minute break. So we'll come back around 10:40. For those of you on the speaker side here, please do turn off video and mute during the break. And we will see you all back in just 10 minutes or so. Thank you all.
Welcome back, everyone. Next slide. My name is Sandra Yanka, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the Duke Margolis Center, and I will be transitioning us to the second session. During this session, we will discuss broad strategies and areas of opportunity for improving representative trial enrollment through community engagement and capacity building. To help kick off this session, we would like to highlight some emerging themes from our landscape review and our expert interviews that will help to frame our panel discussion. Next slide, please. First, making overt efforts to acknowledge and intervene on systemic and structural contributors to poor representation are essential components of improving representative trial enrollment. Within this domain, our discussion today will touch on strategies for ensuring trial participants receive fair compensation and the importance of incorporating health equity into the business components of clinical trial design. Second, diversifying the healthcare and clinical trial workforce are integral to capacity building and fostering trust and accountability within the clinical trial enterprise. Within this domain, our discussion today will touch on strategies that have demonstrated success in building and sustaining genuine relationships with patients and communities, as well as approaches to ensuring that patients and community members have a role in priority setting and trial design. Third, community engaged strategies are most successful when they are approached as genuine relationships with ongoing communication, opportunities for feedback, meaningful efforts to engage with community members outside of trial activities, and sustainable investment in community priorities. Our conversation today will touch on how various stakeholders define community engagement and methods that have demonstrated success in fostering sustainable engagement with underrepresented groups. It is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for the panel session, Andrea Toomey. Andrea is a Health Equity Policy Fellow, core faculty member, and faculty director for Health Equity Education at Duke Margolis. Andrea is also a key expert and thought leader with demonstrated success in developing and implementing community-engaged research initiatives and interventions that combine her expertise in health policy, equity, and financing. Andrea.
Thanks so much, Sandra, for setting up our wonderful panel today. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. But first, I wanted to introduce the members of our panel. First, we have Perla Nunes, who's the Director for Community Health Outreach at the Julius Chambers Biomedical Biotechnology Research Institute. She's a native of Ecuador and has over 30 years in preclinical and clinical research experience. And previously, she oversaw community engagement, outreach, recruitment, and retention efforts of diverse patient populations for clinical research studies. Yasmin Long is a director at Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute, and her expertise lies in health equity, health disparities, health outcomes policy, clinical research, patient engagement, and social determinants of health. And last but not least, we have Dr. Nadine Barrett, who's an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at Duke University. She's a medical sociologist by training, and Dr. Barrett is a health disparities researcher, expert in equity strategist, and a nationally recognized leader in facilitating community and stakeholder and academic partnerships to advance health equity. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Jennifer Byrne, was unable to join us this afternoon due to some unforeseen circumstances, but she sends her best wishes for the panel. So I would just like to kick off with this esteemed panel and group of panelists today. So all of us on the panel understand the value and importance of community engagement, not just in clinical trial participation, but in all facets of healthcare. So before we delve into today's discussion, I would like to hear your thoughts on how you define community engagement and what does community engagement mean in practical terms in your work related to clinical trials. So first, I'll just go left to right on my screen. So Yasmin, I'll turn to you first.
Hi, thanks, Andrea, and thanks the Duke Margolis team for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm thrilled to be joined with my fellow panelists. I'll just quickly say what I do, and then I'll answer your question, Andrea. So I am a director at Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute. The Milken Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. We focus on a number of issues, but mainly ensuring that treatments and therapeutics get to patients much quicker. I lead our health equity and diversity and clinical trials portfolio, where we're looking at achieving health equity across the biomedical research ecosystem using a multi-stakeholder approach. So some of the things we focus on, in addition to diversity in clinical trials, but also diversity in the workforce, the role of patient and community engagement, and also the role of digital health technologies, such as the use of decentralized clinical trials or hybrid trials. All of these are components to building and sustaining community engagement. So I think when I think of how to define that is that it's meaningful. And I'll probably say this quite a bit throughout the panel, but and just kind of reflecting on some of the comments from the panel prior, we have to put the human back into the research, considering human beings, right? I mean, you know, that's show up as a human first, right? So that means if for example, that means if you are developing your research question, which is exactly when you should start thinking about the equity and diversity piece of your research plan and SOPs, not afterwards, not as an afterthought, but as part of the development of that research, right? So if you're trying to answer a specific question and there's a particular community that has a prevalence of that condition, for example, then perhaps connecting with them, that means engaging with community leaders, engaging with community health centers, and starting to build the relationships with them, not coming in and collecting your data and getting it and saying, you know, see you later, but actually building a relationship with them so that one, they're a part of understanding what you're studying, if it impacts their health outcomes, but then two, respecting their lived experience. Lived experience is a valuable expertise. I know that, you know, at least in our US sort of academic culture, of course, we value terminal degrees, MDs, PhDs, yes, of course. But lived experience is also a form of expertise. And I think it's worth asking the patient or asking that community what matters most to them. So what does that look like? It could be conducting a focus group, or a series of focus groups. It could be you know, developing a patient or community engagement advisory council to help inform the development of the research tools you'll be providing, such as, you know, informed consent or the study protocol, so on and so forth. So basically, looking at the patient or a community that's maybe not as highly represented in a particular study or the question that you're trying to answer, really focusing on what their needs are and asking them what that is. So that means you actually have to go in and start building a relationship and building that trust. So I'll pause there because I'm sure there's other great responses to that question. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Yasmin. And I think that point around the humanization of this process is so key. So next I'll turn to Perla.
So thank you so much for having me here, and ditto to everything Yasmin just said. And I just want to add that when we are really engaging the community, that we need to make sure that we're listening to them, right? And that we respect what they're saying and that we acknowledge their recommendations, that we just don't say, oh yeah, thank you for telling us all this, but you know, we'll do X, Y, Z instead, right? So acknowledging what they're saying. And in this way, we allow them to contribute, right? They're contributing in a meaningful way. So I just wanted to add that to what my definition of community engagement is.
Thanks so much, Perla. Yeah, and I think that that point around meaningful contribution on top of the humanization, you know, really are two key elements of how to embed community engagement within this work. So Dr. Barrett, I'll turn to you.
All right, thank you. And thanks again to the Margolis Center and everyone for having us here. It's great to be a part of this panel and of course with these great co-panelists, so great to be here. You know, it's interesting that you asked that question. I find that I agree with what my colleagues have already said in terms of what community engagement is. And I just kind of want to hone in on a couple of things specific to that, right? And one of them is just really the importance of words, and words matter. And so when we think about community engagement, when we think about the terms we use, such as subject instead of a participant, or a partner is even better, really thinking about the words that matter, because those words actually shape how we view the community and our patients. And if it shapes how we view them, whether implicitly or explicitly, it's going to shape how we interact and how we engage. I think I saw a study recently that showed that when we look at most research studies, when they ask the number one reasons why people are not engaging with the health systems or are not accessing research, the first word that most use is the word trust. And it's so interesting because then it takes us right into this space, right, of saying, okay, they don't trust, therefore the problem is them. And so how do we help them to trust? And how do we build trust in the community? When I think about community engagement, it's about being trustworthy partners. It's about being trustworthy as a system. It's about being trustworthy in the things that we do and the things that we're thinking about, and being open and transparent with our community partners. And particularly when we're talking about marginalized and minoritized populations, given, as we all know, the incredible impact that systemic and structural racism has, and the power differentials that plays out in that, and the stereotypes and the assumptions that come with that, it's even more important for us as academicians and as researchers to really take a moment and step back. And instead of asking, how do we build their trust and make them be the target that needs to be changed, making ourselves be the system and the target that needs to be changed to become more effective in how we partner. And that takes listening, as Perla said, it takes being humble, and it takes being intentional about the work that we're going to do. And so therefore, I think, as Lode and others have said in the prior panel, really moving into a space of being proactive. And really being intentional and committed to the work. And that's where we get to start seeing where people are doing great things, we're doing great things, and together we can build out the types of relationships that truly represents what community engagement is supposed to look like.
Yeah, Nadine, thanks so much for raising that distinction between trust and trustworthiness. So just to all of the panelists, just want to hear a little bit about the different strategies that have worked to restore or build trustworthiness within clinical trial teams, among the potential trial participants that have experienced this historic and contemporary examples of structural racism and exclusion when they're participating in clinical trials. So if you can just touch on one or a few strategies, that would be great.
So I'll go first. So in my experience, it has been about going into communities before you go with the ask, right? Go there and just build those relationships, get that trust, and go in with local key stakeholders in the community that they already trust, right? But building those relationships, and it should be bi-directional, right? Like we should go there and volunteer and help out, and before we go in and we start talking about, bringing awareness about what is clinical research, why is it important to participate in clinical trials, and then, come in with, well, there's an opportunity, close by, or, things of that sort. But I think it's important to know that we shouldn't just show up and say, okay, here I am, I'm offering you this clinical trial, and you should be wanting to participate, right? And then after having a presence, continue those relationships, right? Make sure that they feel that you're a part of the community, not just like Yasmin said, just show up and leave right after you've done your clinical trial. So, and it helps with retention. I've seen it work with retention as well. And then other studies, and word of mouth is a great referral source. So if people have a good experience with your team, with your group, they're going to be telling their neighbors or family, their friends, their coworkers. So, and I always used to tell our staff, like, a smile is something that sometimes people, your smile is the only smile they will see today. So make sure that you go in with grace and thankfulness and show people that we care. And we really did, right? So I think that's very important. And that I've seen that work very well.
I'll jump in. I totally agree with you, Perla, on that, and I think of strategies. One is, and you mentioned this earlier, listening. People don't listen. I know I'm being general, of course, but we've got abstractions, but when people are talking, give them your attention and listen. Now, not everyone speaks the King's English, so you might have to listen harder if they have an accent, or even if you speak American English, you could also have some issues with your language as well. So listening not only shows a mechanism of respect, but it also shows that you care, right? If we're not caring about the communities that we're doing the research on, then, I mean, isn't that why we do the work that we do, right? Is to improve health outcomes and population health outcomes. So listening is key. And I think that leads into gaining respect, particularly for a community that might not trust the health system. And go with me here, folks, okay, food. And I say food, and now, of course, you have to know everyone's dietary restrictions and all of that, okay? But let's say you're getting to know the community, you're explaining to them what clinical trials are before you develop your question, as Perla mentioned, but like before you getting to know them, holding a town hall, serving some food, breaking bread with folks, and then saying, this is what a clinical trial is. This is how it, for example, this is how it can improve overall health outcomes or how drugs are developed. That's part of transparency. And that's just automatically shows a level of compassion that I think we're compelled to trust. And then, really earmarking, I think, I know we'll get into more details about funding, but for funding mechanisms to a point where researchers can earmark funds for stakeholder convening, right? So just to do that very thing. So I think that's important. And then I'll just say quickly, when we think about lack of trust, mistrust, distrust, we do focus on a lot of the horrors that have taken place in research over in history, as in, of course, we know the United States Public Health Service study on syphilis at Tuskegee, as well as we know Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken without her consent, but has contributed to enormous advances in science. And then other horrors that have taken place, right? But not everyone, if you say Tuskegee, not everybody, believe it or not, not everyone knows what that means. And some of that could be depending on when they were born and that kind of thing. But one thing I'll say, there are common inequities that take place today. You walk into your doctor's office, they might not speak to you. They might not say good morning to you. They might not look you in the eye, or your pain is denied, or you're misdiagnosed, or you're talked over during your doctor's visit. Those are things that happen today that also make a person not feel that they trust the system. And then the last thing I'll say about that, things that we have to consider when we think about social determinants of health, like if you don't have a job, generally, if you don't have a job, you might not have health insurance. If you don't have health insurance, you might not be accessing health care, and therefore you might not be able to access a clinical trial. So we have to think about all of the nuances that affect access, trust, and those things. And I can't stress enough that if we are empathetic about the respect for humanity, I think that those are things that can be overcome to build trust.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Yasmin, for raising these, really day-to-day examples that patients, families, and communities experience in their interactions with the health system. So we don't even have to go that far back. It really is this daily interaction. So Nadine, I wanted to turn to you really quickly. So you're currently leading several initiatives at Duke to ensure that clinical trials are representative, but specifically working on ensuring that the patient population that's already being seen at Duke is included in these clinical trials. So can you describe some of the different types of policy changes or other solutions that are needed to lower the burden of patient participation in clinical trials from your experience?
Wow. Okay. Yes, I was so ready to answer the last question. I was ready.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Do you want to do we can do that one.
I mean, sure. If you're good with that, I was ready for that. I was excited. I'll interweave them so that way we're not answering. I don't get to answer two at the same time. So Andrea, it's such a great question. And I really, again, I appreciate what my colleagues were just sharing. I think, when we think about some tangible next steps, if you will, around what engagement looks like and how do we move that forward specifically toward increasing diversity in trials. I'll give you two examples really quickly of what we've done and partnerships that have really made a difference for me. And it kind of captures what everyone said. I'll use two examples. First is a church that's in here in Durham. It's called the River Church. It's led by Bishop Godby. He's absolutely outstanding, and so is the congregation there. We actually started engaging with Bishop Godby because one of the people that actually work at Duke, her name is Valerie Worthy, She's a patient navigator here. She actually belongs to that church, and she was also in the Cancer Institute at the same time. We started working together to start the Office of Health Equity there. And during that time, what we decided to do, and what's really important, was that we wanted to find out how to increase diversity in clinical research and trials. But before we started doing that, we said, let's go around to the communities and find out what's important to them. So my focus became, what is it that keeps you up at night? What are the things related to health that's giving you concern, or that's important to your congregations or the people that you serve? So that was like the first step. The second step was we started doing surveys, right? And so I had a grant that I did around Project Place. It was a small one-year grant, but it was allowed me to partner with El Centro, El Pueblo, the churches, the faith organizations, all these different groups. And through that process, when I created the survey, I asked them what questions do they want to ask. Those questions were not relevant to the research study specifically, but it was important for them. And so we were able to add questions that they wanted to get answered about their own constituency groups, and the questions that we wanted to answer where we could collaborate and partner together. So identifying opportunities where we can align our priorities with our community partners is so critical. What we learned through that is that they wanted to learn more, get some more information about specific health issues. So then after a while, I started doing focus groups, et cetera, with the church and with my other organizations and partners. We worked with Asian Focus, which is one of our largest Asian serving community organizations. And we worked with the Muslim community here as well. During that entire process, then what we now have is partners that one day, a few years later, after we've done focus groups, et cetera, Bishop Galbi literally said to me, Dr. Barrett, you keep talking about research, you keep talking about clinical trials, and we've done focus groups and surveys and all these great things. We've done things with you in the community outside of the church. When are you going to bring a clinical trial to our church? And so that's when we actually took a clinical research study and brought the phlebotomist, the blood drawer, and everything to address stomach cancer that is caused by H. pylori. People participated. Within 2 hours, we had 92 people that participated in the study. So I think that the power of the relationship became such that the community partner actually wanted to have a clinical trial. And I was holding back saying, I'm not sure if we're all ready for that yet. So I think that it really is about engaging with our community, aligning priorities and finding out what's important to them, ensuring that there's navigation where people may not have a medical home, that we get them a medical home through that process. And through the partnership, they're actually able to use that same data to move their own mission forward, because maybe their mission isn't about the things that we want to focus on, but they have access to the community and they're trustworthy and they can move that forward. So I'll use that as an example. Another great example is the Amy Zion Heal partnership with Duke Health and a group of faith leaders that do all kinds of work, where we're already, again, working with kidney disease with Dr. Ope Olabisi and our phenomenal leaders over Amy Zion. And now we're actually having efforts and programs in their communities and bringing the clinical research and trials to them.
Great, thanks so much, Nadine. And I think a common theme that's arising from this discussion already is this point around relationship building that has to happen before we even think about the research itself. And it needs to continue throughout the process and going into the communities and, really being a partner from that community perspective, not just a transactional relationship for the sake of research. So Perla, I wanted to turn to you quickly too, to hear about your experience working with Latino populations in particular. So if you can talk through some of the benefits that you've seen in engaging with community partners in clinical trials. You already touched upon this a little bit, but if there's anything else that you wanted to add about specific community engaged strategies that have worked to increase enrollment among Latino populations in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I'm Latina, so I'm very passionate about making sure that we respect the culture, right? And so when we go into the Latino communities, making sure that we go from a space where, again, we want to listen to them and make sure that we actually answer the questions. They say we're very transparent about it. And, a lot of times, and I know Dr. Barrett started this Just Ask program, right? You just ask people about, participating in clinical trials after you've gone through the whole thing. And you'd be surprised how many are willing to participate in a clinical trial if you just ask and go through, what is a clinical trial? What does it entail? All those questions. But I know I've been very successful wherever I've worked with the Latino population because I understand our culture, and I understand that sometimes, we have Latinos, we're going to be late to our appointments. They're going to bring their children, and just be prepared for that. And just making sure that they're felt that they are welcomed. And so that has really worked. And with the Latino population, again, we've worked very well using promotoras de salud, which are your community health workers, going through the churches. They trust their curas, their priests, or pastors. And so them letting us come in and speak to the community, and, always having a little bit of food. Music is good too, Zumba, having some kind of event where we would have Zumba. So just having that cultural humility, right? Knowing that I'm one of them, and I understand, and I dance bachata and all the stuff that they know how to dance. So that has worked well for me.
Great, thanks so much, Perla. So I wanted to pull in a question from the audience around what role can patients or patient advocacy groups play in advocating for clinical trial representativeness, and how can both patients and the groups push this agenda forward with researchers? So anyone on the panel can start.
I'll jump in. I think one thing could be really expanding the CHW community health worker workforce, not only to help build trust, but also to help navigate the health system, right? In some ways. I mean, now, this is my personal opinion, but it doesn't matter the level of education you have, right? Navigating the health system is difficult for everybody, right? I think for many of us who have worked in healthcare or physicians, or, we know how to sort of we know what to do for the most part, or we know where to find the information to do that. A lot of people don't, and it doesn't matter their educational status or socioeconomic status either. So I think helping people to navigate health systems, which could lead to what a clinical trial is, what it does, the impact it might have. You're providing a humanitarian service to the population. I mean, people are actually willing to do those kinds of things, but there might be a middleman that helps to ease those barriers. And then I'd also say a measure of accountability. So, going back to ask them what they need, ask them what they want, let's say not coming to your doctor's office. Let's say you're showing up for a clinical trial and you're taking a medication that's, not yet approved, but you're in the trial because that's the only therapeutic available, right? For example, I'm just using this as an example. But when we think about barriers, there could be obviously transportation barriers, childcare, or you're taking another medication, you're not feeling well. Those are the kinds of things, if you just ask, then you'd say, oh, okay, I understand. Okay, well, let's pivot this way, right? Or let's collect these resources, whether it's financial, whether it's human capital, whether it's training and education for physicians and researchers, right? And I mean cultural training, right? Some of the things you were saying, Perla, I mean, one thing that just comes into my head is, let's say you want to engage with the Latino community. Hopefully you'll have, if someone on the team is bilingual in Spanish, for example, and if they're not, as the PI or the sponsor, perhaps you can learn a couple of things, how to say hello, how to say thank you, how to say good evening. Those are things that automatically say trying, and you respect that person, right? Or that group. So I think those are three. I think those were three. So I'll pause there.
Great, thanks so much, Yasmin. Perla or Nadine, and Nadine, I also wanted to give you an opportunity to answer the trustworthy question if you wanted to add anything else to your great comments already.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I'll be happy to jump in. I think a couple quick things too that kind of really speaks to me, and I think some of it are also things people are asking. But so the patient groups piece and the advocacy, I think that that's a powerful question to ask, because what we don't do when we think about community engagement is when we go out and do education in community, even with community health workers, we're not including the research participation as part of that discussion. So in order to really normalize clinical trials as a conversation that happens just as much as we're talking about diabetes management or kidney disease awareness or anything along those lines, we need to start incorporating that as part of the conversation and part of the dialogue, so that someone shouldn't hear the words, "you've got cancer," and hear, "would you like to be in a clinical trial?" at the same time, and that's the first time they're ever hearing about a clinical trial. It should be something that we normalize. So that's one side note I would say there too, in terms of strategies. In terms of the trustworthiness work, I mean, right now we're leading one here, it's called Project Entrust, and we're really focusing in on systems change, which is, I think, what you spoke about earlier, right? And you asked me earlier, how do we start to create the types of systems change that happens? So with a program that we lead, Dr. Susanna Nagy and I lead, that's called Ready. We're really kind of honing in on this type of work, both with our Project Entrust that we're doing across Duke Health, but also in terms of what we're doing within our clinic, making the clinic available and ready for people to be able to engage in research and trials, ensuring that our research teams have what they need to be able to participate and engage as well. And also making sure that, as was mentioned, people have the appropriate training. And so I do have a training that I have developed here. It's now nationally rolled out by ASCO and ACCC, and it's disease agnostic, but it is called Just Ask. And the whole idea about this is it's couched in systemic and structural racism. It hones in on implicit biases and specifically helps teams to think about what strategies they need to utilize to be able to increase diversity in clinical research and trials. Community engagement being one of those key strategies. There's also system strategies that need to be changed as well. Now we actually have this training across all of Duke that people can be able to access, and it's also available nationally. But I think that it can't stop there, right? We can make trainings all day long, and I love them. Don't get me wrong, I love my training. I think it's great, not that I'm biased. But I think that it also means that we need to think about, what do we do when we get training, and what do we need to start doing as policies within our institutions? So we have an FDA policy, but my question isn't guideline. But my question is, what are we doing within our systems to incorporate policies that we can actually manage? Or a health system, a university can make their own policies specific to engaging diverse populations. But I think we tend to only wait until the FDA says it, now we're going to follow it. What are we doing actually systemically to do that? And I think that there's many of us that are operating in that space, but I think that we need to start creating intentional task force within our organizations that are specifically about dismantling inequities and increasing access to clinical trials at the organizational level, and stop waiting for the system to make that change. And also having the accountability metrics that goes with it.
Andrea, can I piggyback on that just a little
please.
bit? And this is just kind of, sometimes I have a bird's eye view, based on the type of organization I represent. But, and I'm going to add a personal anecdote. I've never been asked to be in a clinical trial in my entire life, right? So never. And so that's one. I mean, it might help to ask if they want to join a clinical trial, right? And I'm not being, I mean, I'm being serious, but it's almost like, if you don't ask, then how do they know, right? And then another thing I just want to mention, that when we think about inequities in the healthcare system or lack of access to clinical trials, and that lack of access can include not being asked, but also, it doesn't matter like I said, it doesn't matter your socioeconomic status or your, income or education. I'll just say I have access to high quality healthcare, right? But does that mean I don't experience inequities and disparities in the healthcare system? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because there are biases that everybody has, regardless of race and ethnicity, and those biases can also be within that same race and ethnicity. So I think those are the things, the cultural things that we have to consider, in addition to the technical and the development part. I think that's still part of that humanistic thought. But recognizing those kinds of things, and if I wouldn't have told you that, you wouldn't have known, and that might be helpful information if I wanted to be a part of a clinical trial. So just kind of thinking not outside the box, but also thinking of other nuances that can contribute to that.
Great, thanks so much, Yasmin. And I think, this, the points that we're raising on this panel today of looking at both these technical as well as like technical barriers, but also, biases that come up are preventing the uptake of certain populations in clinical trials. So I did want to turn the conversation a bit to these various barriers and delve into that a little bit more. So Perla, I wanted to turn to you. So one of the barriers to participation is payment. So what policies stand in the way of fair and just payment for participation in clinical trials? And particularly from your work with Latino communities, what strategies or policy changes are needed to make sure that patients can be appropriately compensated in their trial participation?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question and one that gets me on my soapbox. So, compensation, pretty much all studies require people to give a social security number in order to be compensated. And if we want to make sure that we include the Latino community, we have to realize that some don't have a social security number. So if you're going to require that for someone to participate in a clinical trial and a person is willing, so here we've, gone through everything about bringing awareness about clinical research. The person is ready to consider it, told them, ask all the questions, that's your right. You can, you can withdraw from participation at any time. We let them know everything. And then they're interested in a clinical trial. And when they don't have a social security number to be compensated with, they're not eligible for the study at that point. I mean, that to me is like, we have to make sure that we think outside the box and we figure out a way. I know at Duke, because I used to work at Duke, Duke has, where you can waive the right to give your social security number and not receive payment, which is not right either, right? I wish all people would be able to receive payment, but if they want to participate in a clinical trial because, they're sick or, and this is the only care they're going to have, they should be able to do it, and not that they're not able to because they don't have a social security number, right? So do we want people to make up numbers and just throw down 9 numbers or however many numbers it is? And I've seen it done at Duke, and I'll keep repeating this because Duke has done a great job with this, where, you can make the payments through a third party. So it's Centro Hispano in Durham, and then they compensate the participants, probably not the same amount for the clinical trial, but figuring out ways that participants who don't have a social security number can participate in clinical trials has to be done. I mean, and I know that it's for tax purposes, but if we need people to participate in clinical trials, we need to think outside the box and how we can make this work.
Thanks so much for raising those important points, Perla. And Nadine, I wanted to turn to you to talk about barriers that emerge more with the providers and with the clinical trial teams. And you touched on this already a bit with the training programs that you've developed. But can you discuss some of the strategies that are needed to ensure that providers are better equipped to be able to respond to community priorities? And part of this too, I wanted to pull in this question from the audience around workforce development. And so, is trust enhanced by our prioritization of diversity in research workforce recruitment? So thinking about, both the strategies to better equip the providers, but also prioritizing diversity within those teams themselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. And at the CTS side, we have phenomenal leaders there that's doing some great work around workforce development and pathways programs. Amanda McMillan, Steve Grambo, and others, and they're just doing a phenomenal job with that. And I think that one of the things that's important with that is that the partnership between NCCU, which is our local HBCU here, and also a partnership with Durham Tech and their Clinical Research Associates program is really critical for us to really think about how do we engage our diverse populations. And so Durham Tech, for example, 70% of their students that are in those programs are actually from underrepresented, marginalized, and or minoritized populations who are in their Clinical Research Associates programs. That's a wonderful opportunity for us to really move the needle in diversifying the research workforce. I think it's also important, however, that as we continue to do that work, and we should never stop it. In fact, the more we can accelerate and enhance, the better. At the same time, we also need to recognize that even with all the diversity that we have within this country, the likelihood of having race concordant representation is quite slim, right? So the likelihood of me as a Black person seeing another Black person that talked to me about a clinical research or study is quite slim. However, being able to be in an environment where even if the person that I'm talking to may not be the same race or ethnic background that I am, but I'm looking around and see the rest of their team has diversity, that speaks volumes also about the environment that I'm in. So it's not so much about well, it is important to have race concordant and we need to have diversity, but we also need to recognize that the one-on-one may not necessarily be the answer because we don't have enough people to make that actually happen. So I think that that's really important. And I do think that the more we work on these workforce development efforts, being very intentional as organizations, who are you hiring? What's the processes that you're using? And ensuring that you're speaking to experts who know how to diversify your candidate pool so that you can really pick people who are coming from a diverse background to be a part of your team.
Great. Thanks so much, Nadine, for offering those specific examples. So another key player to making trials more representatives are community-based organizations themselves. So I wanted to hear from all of the panelists what different funding mechanisms are needed to be able to mobilize more flexible and sustainable support for CBOs or community academic partnerships in clinical trial teams, and what strategies have you found to have worked in your experience?
Andrea, I wanted to just jump back to the question about the workforce development.
Of course, yes.
So I recently worked at Greater Gift, which is a nonprofit organization that celebrates clinical trial participants. And through Greater Gift, we started the Mary Hoffman Murphy Scholarship to engage minority students who are pursuing a higher degree in clinical research. So with that, we've established a scholarship at Winston-Salem State for minority students pursuing a master's in clinical research, at Durham Tech for students pursuing an associate's degree, and at UNC Wilmington for minority students pursuing a clinical research degree. And I went and spoke with a group at UNC Wilmington called Mikasa, which is high school students that are looking at what they're going to do when they're in college, right? What they want to do when they grow up. And, you know, I spoke to them about clinical research and the need for bilingual staff in clinical research. And I had 3 girls come up to me after that. And they had never heard about clinical research being a career option, right? And so they wanted to learn more about it. And I'm still in contact with them. And you know, they're just, they're juniors in high school. So I'm hoping that, and they're bilingual. So I just, you know, just keep talking about it. So many people don't know what clinical research is a profession, and we just have to keep talking about it. So I just wanted to talk about that, and I'll let the other 2 speak.
Tommy, Andrea, do you mind repeating that last question that you just asked before?
Yeah, no, of course. Yes, let me just pull it up. So just wanted to hear your thoughts on different funding mechanisms to be able to mobilize more flexible and sustainable support for CBOs or community academic partnerships in clinical trial teams.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm going to say 2 different things, right? It's hard to find So first, if anyone from industry who has foundations or sponsor funds, I would encourage you to kind of put your funds in those types of areas where you can actually support to build capacity for community-based organizations to be equitable partners with academic institutions. For those of us that are researchers that are doing work where we're getting NIH funding, Robert Wood Johnson funding, et cetera, I would really encourage us to ensure that when we write those grants, that we have communities right there with us writing those grants so that we can be able to engage them in that process. In the meantime, I just kind of want to highlight a program that we have here at Duke. That's it's actually a grant that we got, and then it was me, Susanna Nagy, and Denise Snyder, I'll never forget, working together for this grant, and it's what we call the READY initiative. And READY actually stands for the Research Equity and Diversity Initiative. So we actually utilize this funds to kind of start building capacity with our community-based organizations for them to be their own partners in research that we can engage collaboratively. So that means understanding from them, what do they see as their barriers? What do they see as what's needed in order to have full capacity in their organization to truly partner with us in an equitable way when we apply for NIH funding, foundation funding, et cetera. So I just think that it's really important that we can't wait. We can't just kind of say, oh, there's no funding for this. It's really identifying ways to do that. And the other thing too is that when we hear about pharma like Merck and others that have these quick capacity building grants that come out, we need to make sure that we're engaging with our community partners to let them know about that grant and work with them to apply for that grant together as a collaborator. So let's kind of share the wealth, if you will, so that we can be able to make that kind of impact. In the meantime, I also hope that we can start seeing, like, for example, what's happened at the NIH with the Compass grants now, where they actually have the community leading those grants and academic institutions being the subcontract. I'm hoping that that is really moving us in the direction that we need to go in terms of really changing the landscape and who we call a partner, who we call experts at the table. When I talk about my community partners, they're either partners or they're my community colleagues. That's who we are, nothing else. So that way we're not talking about them as if there's something different from them and us. So I think it's really important for us to move into that space as well.
And Nadine, I just want to highlight too, I love how you refer to your community partners as colleagues, to your earlier point about language and how words matter. Yasmin?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of going back to the fair compensation question, if that's okay, but I just wanted to chime in and think about a couple of things. One, think about compensation is being compensated is fair, period, right? So, you know, for example, having a study participant, you know, enroll in a study and, you know, there could be no compensation, or there could be, you know, sort of a small compensation, depending on what that is. Full disclosure, earlier in my career, I worked on several clinical research studies when I was at Johns Hopkins, and all of those participants were compensated, whether it be some of it was money order, some of it was cash, because of one for the types of procedures that were taking place, but also time is very valuable because you can't get it back. You just can't, you know, and so I think that's something to consider when compensating or even reimbursing for transportation, maybe childcare. You know, meet people where they're at, and that might mean having policies that require a certain level of compensation, or maybe it includes earmarking that in grant funding to ensure that, or maybe you're, you know, compensation for the community partners, maybe you're using their venues, whatever it is. I think that when we think about fair, just a reminder that time is valuable, and people's time is valuable, and that should be heavily considered in participating in clinical trials.
Great, thanks so much, Yasmin. And I know that we only have about 5 minutes left. So I actually, before we go to the last question, Yasmin, I wanted to turn to you quickly again about if you can briefly discuss some of the strategies that can help overcome the tension point between incorporating equity into business processes of clinical trials while maintaining community engagement as authentic as possible.
You know, and I'll keep this brief. Return on investment. Right. And there's return on investment, financial return on investment, which let's say that would be one of the industry priorities, there's many, but just one, right? And then for communities, what's the return on investment for the impact of that research that they're participating in? Will they receive the results? Will it be translated in terms that they can understand so that that can be applied to that community or applied to that individual? I think that's important. But I think the business cases that there are, what do we say, the carrot and the stick? But thinking about it in a way that's that both parties get what they want, right? So the drugs being developed, you have your representative population in an ideal world, and then that's a return on investment, for that sponsor, for example. But what about the return on investment for the community? I'll just say this very, very quick story. There was a study I worked on early in my career, and I say this in some of my other talks. So if you've seen me speak before, forgive me, but I have to say this. But I had a participant who, filling out the survey back when it was paper surveys, collecting the data and specimens and things. And the study participant said, "So will I see the results of the study?" And I was in my early 20s there. So I didn't give him an answer because I was trying to think, because in my head, I was like, no, you're not. Because one, you have to access this peer reviewed journal, which is probably behind a paywall. Second, you might not be able to understand the language that we use when we're writing peer reviewed type of journals and how that data is analyzed. So I think it's the responsibility, research teams, sponsors, PIs, all that are a part of that, to provide something to them as like a mechanism that shares the results of that study in the terminology that they will understand. Now, that might mean asking them that, what would be more comfortable, how would you be able to uptake this information? Or you just have, or if there's a staff person who can, synthesize that information. I think that's important, because otherwise, if you're testing this on a particular community, or you're collecting this data and running it from your trial, and they don't have access to the outcomes, well, that's not a return on investment, in my personal opinion. So there's many ways of return on investment. I think in turn that could also have increased financial returns for sponsors as well, when we really think about it, ROI and human beings and achieving the goals that we want for the research. If we really think about that all together, I think that could have great financial returns for sponsors, as well as the community, and getting that information once that study is completed.
Great. Nadine, did you want to comment on that too?
Oh, I actually saw something. Someone said another thought someone shared. I think it was a colleague of mine, actually, Martin Mendoza, around, instead of return on investment, return on value. And so I'm just lifting that up and amplifying that I just saw from. So he's with All of Us program. So I also wanted to just kind of highlight something else too, when we talk about this ghosting and our patient experience particularly. So the ghost criteria. So we're looking for sometimes the magic bullet, right? On how do we get people into clinical trials, when most of our studies are not even in recruiting our demographics that's coming into the clinics. And so I do want to kind of highlight that although we're talking about community engagement, which is important, that it's also important for us to think about engaging our communities is also about engaging our patients when they're coming into the clinics to get care. And if we're using ghost criteria for our clinical trials, then those ghost criteria may not necessarily basically cut and paste oftentimes from one study to the next without truly understanding, is it truly an indicator that's going to be a problem for that person to be on that trial? And oftentimes the criteria used are criteria that disproportionately minoritized populations are dealing with, or medications that they're taking to take care of hypertension, blood pressure, diabetes, et cetera. So I just wanted to also highlight that as well and amplify this comment.
Great, thanks so much, Nadine. So now in 1 minute each, could you comment just in closing, the 1 or 2 steps that you would prioritize to encourage more widespread access to clinical trials in community settings?
So yeah, Yasmin, do you mind if I go?
No, go ahead, please.
So specifically for me with the Latino community, I would ask that if we're going to offer studies in Spanish, right? Everything's been translated to Spanish, that we have staff that's bilingual as well, because using a translator is not the answer. So if if you really want to include the Latino community, and you know that in the area, the Latino community only speaks Spanish, if you have all the information in Spanish, also have bilingual staff that can enroll participants and be able to answer questions that people have instead of, going back and forth, right, between the coordinator. And then thinking outside the box about having evening hours for enrollment, weekend hours for enrollment. Not everyone is living the same situation. Some people cannot leave their job during the day to go and participate in a clinical trial. So I feel like we need to cater to our participants if that's who we want really, and honestly, we want to have them participate in our trials. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Perla. Yasmin?
Yeah, very quickly. So I'll say kind of what I was saying, but meeting patients and communities where they're at, 1, 2, understanding that community. That means building the relationship, understanding their needs, and adding some empathy to that as well. I think it's helpful. And then my third comment, which I just can't say enough, is respect for humanity and human beings, and looking at people as people, like we all are, and that we all access the healthcare system at some point in our lives as individuals or our families, and really putting yourself in someone's shoes, regardless of what you may think or assume them. Don't assume, ask.
Great, thank you, Nadine.
If we really want to do community engagement well, in order to increase diversity in clinical research and trials, and broad representation, it is critical that if you don't have, or your organization, you do not have the expertise of what it means to engage with the community, create partnerships and collaborations, because I don't want us to think that this is something that you just kind of wake up in the morning, you've got the skills. And there's people that actually spent their entire career in education focusing on building our skill sets around community engagement and understanding those nuances. So I would encourage people to identify their local CTSI, their Clinical Translation Science Institute, and their engagement core. Go to your cancer centers, who also has a community engagement core. And if nothing else, at least reach out to someone, people in your community who's trustworthy, and go with a humble spirit to kind of say who you are, what you're trying to do, and how you also want to learn about the community. While doing that, understanding the dynamics of race and ethnicity in that community. In Durham, there's a very strong relationship between the health system and the Black community and the Latino community more recently, because they're more recent to this region. So I think it's really important to understand that history and how that also plays out in people being able to grow in trust. But the part that the trust comes from is when you as an individual researcher show up in a trustworthy way, then you can work together toward building that trust with each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to everyone on the panel. I think it was really wonderful to hear, how, at the end of the day, this really is about listening and asking and respect. But to Nadine's point, this is a specific skill set. And there are people with that skill set. And so, increasing capacity to be able to do community engagement within clinical trials will be key. And, as we heard from all of the panelists, ask the community and align those community priorities to the science. So thank you again to Yasmin, Perla, and Nadine. I now wanted to hand it over to the Duke-Margolis Center Director, Mark McClellan, to begin the next portion of the meeting.
Andrea, thanks very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for participating. I want to thank our speakers in particular for the last session, a great discussion on opportunities for greater and more representative community engagement in clinical trials. As Andrea mentioned, I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. I'm also an independent director on the boards of Alignment Healthcare, Cigna, and Johnson & Johnson. And I'd like to get right into this next session, our fireside chat with Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Bibbins-Domingo with us today. She's the Lee Goldman Endowed Professor of Medicine and Professor of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. And as I think many of you know, she's also the 17th editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Medical Association and overseeing the JAMA network. She also chaired the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's landmark 2022 report on improving representation in clinical trials and research. So we're going to have a brief discussion on recent progress and some of the early follow-up and impact of that National Academy's report, as well as some of Dr. Bibbins-Domingo's perspectives on these issues based on her experience as editor of, I think, Kirsten's one of the very top-rated medical and scientific journals in the world in terms of impact. So, we'll dive right in. Thanks for being with us today.
Not at all. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I had to join via my iPad. I'm having some computer problems, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Well, that's okay. The times we live in. Kirsten, I wanted to start with the National Academy's report, which endorsed a number of important systems level recommendations intended to drive change on a broad scale on representativeness, diversity in clinical trials, including recommendations around reporting and accountability, federal incentives, adequate compensation for research participants, which is a big topic of discussion in the last session, and ensuring a diverse and inclusive workforce, especially in leadership position. What's your sense of how it's going overall? What are the biggest themes or assessments that you have so far of the impact of that report on trial diversity and representation? I know we're just a year into it now, but any early sense of impact?
Well, let me just tell you, we did this report during the pandemic, and I was really reluctant to take on a task of chairing a committee like this because a lot of people have written about how we're not making a lot of progress in this regard. And I and the people who joined this group were really passionate on this topic. I have to say the few things that struck us and that really underlies our approach to the recommendations was we've been talking about this for way too long and have not really made substantial progress. It's the type of thing that almost every part of our clinical trials enterprise thinks is important, or at least we pay lip service to, and then we can't quite get it done. And we do this year after year after year. And it's the type of thing where it seems like everybody thinks we should do something, but no one really knows what they should do. And yet, as your panel talked through the last session, which I really loved the panel, like people are accomplishing this at very local levels. And so that's why we focused on what are the types of regulations, mostly to our federal players and mostly to our academic communities, that we can put in place to enable more of the good stuff that people who do this locally can accomplish. What are those things that are the carrots? What are the sticks? What are the measurements that we can use to make sure we're accountable to try to move this forward? And I think the thing that I'm most pleased by is that people are talking about it. You're talking about it here. Others are talking about it. You see the FDA making initial strides in this area. You see the NIH making initial strides in this area. But mostly you see, a lot of groups that are engaged in the actual work pushing on what we need to do better. And I'm hoping that conversation is what continues to go forward.
Well, I do want to follow up on those comments. Maybe we could start with, since we are a policy program, start with some of the important federal agencies, as you mentioned, that were highlighted in the report and that are starting to respond and taking some further steps. We heard from FDA, for example, earlier in this meeting. What is your sense of how the NIH and FDA responses are going? I know it's still early on, but maybe you could focus on what further actions you think might be most important, or what further progress you'd like to see.
Yeah, I think that I think I'm really encouraged by the FDA actions. I think that they're really essential, and that both the FDA and the NIH have been pushed to really think about what they can push in this area. I'm always a little concerned when people say, well, this is just going to slow down the work that we're doing, without recognizing that making a change has the potential to accelerate the work that we're doing. If we can engage more people, create more systems to engage more people in trials, it can actually have the potential to accelerate the type of work that we're doing. So I do think a key to all of this is actually the enforceability of existing regulations. The FDA has many tools in its toolkit right now that if it held those people who come before the FDA accountable, they could actually reinforce that. Same with the NIH. There are many tools right now in terms of thinking through progress of the conduct of trials. And so some of this is enforcing tools that we already have now. Some of it, and these were a little bit more controversial, I would say, within the recommendations that we made, are even thinking about positive incentives in terms of drugs, for example, making it to approval more quickly that can show representation in the types of enrollment. This is where I've been thinking much more, and we did in the report, about the roles of the payers and CMS. That's I think an actor that we focused a lot on in the report, probably hasn't played as much of a role. And I've been really intrigued with the conversations of CMS playing a role in saying, well, you know, we're not going to fund a particular drug or reimburse for a particular drug because it's not been studied in the diverse populations of the US. And I think there's opportunity there to think more about CMS playing a role in enabling the types of infrastructure that needs to happen for these trials to be conducted in practice settings.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that. As you know, I have some background at CMS as well.
Yes.
And much of our work at Duke-Margolis is focused on how CMS and other payers can support better evidence. There are some programs in place now. So Medicare does generally cover the routine cost of care in conjunction with a clinical trial. And thanks to recent bipartisan federal legislation, state Medicaid programs are also generally required to cover routine costs. But as you said, CMS has taken some steps, some older, but some very much in the news recently, including around Alzheimer's disease monoclonal antibody drugs under their coverage with evidence program to try to encourage, as you said, more evidence relevant to more diverse populations. Now, CMS doesn't have direct authority to pay for a research infrastructure, but it can, as you said, create incentives to help support it. So could you talk a little bit more about how you think that's going? Maybe we can spend a couple of minutes on following up on this. I think it's an important topic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really intrigued by the actions that CMS has taken. I do think they're compatible with us thinking about both generating the best possible evidence and then using that to really improve clinical outcomes. So I think CMS has such a pivotal role at both parts to either enable or say, well, no, let's hold off because we need to continue to gather evidence, as is the case with the Alzheimer's drugs. I think I'm not going to directly answer this question, but I'm going to say one of the things that I think has to be in place. One of the things that struck me when we talked to the FDA, when we talked to people at NIH, when we talked to others who have responsibilities within this space, is how little consistent data they have to really understand the progress that's being made. And I think that's one of the reasons we called for sort of a higher level. It's hard to say that government committees are going to make things better, but like a higher level sort of coordinating committee that might think across these. So let's take the Alzheimer's drug example. Like, can we think of a way in which we are both collecting the data and that we have more of the agencies working in lockstep to create those types of incentives for the outcomes that we all say that we want. And I think what's happening right now that I'm encouraged by is each of these agencies taking steps that show they have some power in this space. What I worry about is that it ultimately does require a fair level of coordination if we're going to achieve the goals that we have, and even the data infrastructure to know what are the trials, where are we collecting data, how can we think about outcomes. That's not something we're doing consistently, because when you have the highest level people at different agencies say, I don't have that data, you know that data is not being collected in the way it should be if we're going to have that goals at the federal level.
Yeah, and that kind of coordination, having worked in government, and as I know you're familiar with as well, takes some advanced planning, takes some time and effort. And I think one of the challenges that CMS is facing now with the Alzheimer's drugs, on the one hand, they'd very much like to get broader evidence available on more diverse populations. On the other hand, the trials that were conducted had some significant efforts around enrolling additional patients. As you said, maybe not as much transparency or not as much results there as you'd really like. They seem to show, at least for the recently fully approved lecanemab, some real impact across the broad population on an outcome that matters and met the FDA primary endpoints. And so I think CMS is feeling trapped, and you're seeing the criticism of the agency on two sides now for, well, we could not cover as quickly, but that would, given our current infrastructure, take longer to develop the evidence, maybe get in the way of access for a treatment that, at least in this broad set of pivotal trials that met FDA standards, seems to show effectiveness and at least arguably should be an option for patients. Or if we go ahead and with the approvals now, are we really doing all we could to change that infrastructure? So I'm not sure if there, is this something from like a journal editor perspective, or there are ways to accelerate? It seems like there is some culture changes taking place, some infrastructure development happening, but it seems like it's going slower than a lot of people we've heard from today would like to see happen.
I agree, but I think we oftentimes are trapped in that particular dilemma that we say, but we have data now, so we have to rush to do it this way. I think if we're willing to collect data in an ongoing fashion in clinical settings to decide how we use that data to alter drug approvals and things like that, we're acting as if our tools are only these blunt tools of cover, don't cover, or like approve, don't approve. In reality, we can collect data in a variety of settings. That should be the goal we all have. And I'll just remind you, because JAMA published the donanemab trial yesterday, and one of the editorials reviewed the number of enrollments for all three of the Alzheimer's drugs, the monoclonal antibodies, and there's a total of 52 Black participants across the three approval drugs. So yes, there is, people have tried, but I don't think we're anywhere close for a condition that that disproportionately actually affects, or at least in terms of poorer outcomes, many of the minoritized populations. That 52 across three very large trials is enough. It's not, and I think we can't be willing to say, oh, but we just have to rush to approval. We have to say, okay, let's do what we can to continue to collect data, to continue to be thoughtful, instead of just thinking of this as a switch on or off.
And you, and in the report, it mentioned, and it came up today, it came up in our review, the background document prepared for this meeting, the role of so-called pragmatic trials, or as you mentioned, platforms, or ongoing data collection efforts that could be more integrated with routine care that could connect people who may not have great connections to the research enterprise, but often do have a community provider, a physician, a pharmacist, someone who they have a trusted relationship with. Could also address some of the points about trust and entry and awareness that we've heard about today. What do you think could help accelerate the availability of those kinds of complements to the traditional way we've done pivotal clinical trials for product approvals?
Yeah, I think it's I'm a big fan of what we have learned in watching them play out almost oftentimes in other countries that have more integrated sort of clinical systems, have more of a culture of thinking about research integrated into practice, of seeing what's possible when you have that in place. The analogy that I like from one of my colleagues who says about the platform trials, rather than building the stadium, like each time you're playing the game, is building the stadium once so that you can play the game multiple times. But it does require a culture shift. This is a different way of thinking. And what I had been encouraged by was the platform trials that developed during the pandemic, the need to have the types of information that we needed in an ongoing fashion during a public health emergency. What I'm concerned about is the snapping back of like business as usual to how we've always conducted trials. And I do think the infrastructure, all of the stakeholders that make trials possible are entrenched in the way things are now. And I think it really takes all of us thinking the way things are now is not ideal. We have to do something different. And that requires many parts of this enterprise thinking differently to get there. And so I'm optimistic that's where we need to be. I'm unfortunately a little discouraged that we snap back too quickly and like, let's just do business as usual, frankly.
Well, I appreciate your continuing to bring these issues forward. The last topic I wanted to get to was focusing more on your current role as the editor-in-chief of the JAMA Network, which has a tremendous US and global reach. You highlighted some of the things that you're doing to keep these kinds of issues on the forefront, to help drive that culture change, such as the accompanying editorial yesterday around the lecanemab trial. Not to put you on the spot too much, but what else can and should leading journal editors be doing to make progress here?
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility to do more. I think during the conduct of that National Academies report, there, I think that the people who are most hardline on this issue say, well, we should reject studies if they don't, just like we reject trials if they're not registered in clinicaltrials.gov, if they don't have a very clearly defined protocol, we should reject studies that don't have representative enrollment. I think that's a very hard position for editors, frankly, in part because we are a global journal. And one of the issues that you talked about in the earlier session is that we have to find a way to understand that to prioritize representation for things that happen in the US and to understand what we learn from trials that enroll populations outside the US. And I think for a journal, it's very hard to take a very narrow focus and say, well, only if it matches the population demographics in the US will we publish a study when we want to always be publishing the best studies. I do like steps that have been taken, for example, at the New England Journal of Medicine, where they're really publishing the demographics of the population to whom a particular study is intended to apply, so that readers at least can make a decision, can understand, oh, wow, this study really does have most of the people affected are over age 80, and this trial that is supposed to be for those people really enrolled people in their 60s. So that at least allows readers to engage in the discussion. I think journals have to do more on the editorial side, on the pushing authors of whether they could do more with what they're doing. But I think the hard and fast rule of saying we won't publish unless. But I also think this is all of our responsibility in an academic enterprise. And I think journals could be willing to do more if they aligned with what a regulator or a payer or a funder were doing. And I that's one of the things I want to do within the JAMA network is if CMS or NIH or FDA say, this is where we want to go, and we think you would help us by aligning this way, I think that's what we have to start doing.
Well, it sounds like we've already started down that road thanks to your efforts at JAMA and some of the others that we've talked about today. This is not easy. We're talking about some pretty fundamental culture change when it comes to the design and conduct engagement around research. It needs a different kind of infrastructure, but we've seen some progress in that regard. Any final thoughts, last comments? Are you optimistic about the future? Any final thoughts for the participants today?
I'm optimistic because I really love that you're holding this session, that you've devoted the entire time to this topic, because I think the more people hear, the big academic institutions who are conducting a lot of trials talking about it in this way, I think the more people start to see, oh, this is something that is an annoyance to me getting my trial done, but this is the way trials should be done, and people can do it this way, and that engages more of us in thinking about the potential solutions. So I am optimistic, and I think it requires all of us pushing a little bit more on this.
Well, Dr. Bibbins-Domingo, thanks so much for joining us today, for helping to push a little bit more and hopefully making some more rapid progress on these critical topics. We really appreciate you being with us and really appreciate your leadership on diversity and engagement and improving clinical trial representation.
Thank you so much.
And I'd like to turn right to our next session. We've got a lot to cover today, building on the discussion so far today on defining the role of various stakeholders in improving trial representation. In this session, we're going to include recommendations for stakeholders, as well as a panel discussion about some actionable steps that stakeholders can take, some relevant accountability measures for helping us track progress on trial representation efforts. I would add to that, as we've heard, that there are some important new kinds of coordination that have to take place, and some new steps in building our infrastructure. Those steps do take time and they do have cost. So how can we do that as effectively as possible as well? So we're going to cover these issues of fostering a culture of representative and trustworthy research, the potential role of point of care platform and other pragmatic trial approaches to augment our existing clinical trial system, and strategies for addressing remaining gaps in making operational the goal of representative enrollment. We've got a number of different valuable perspectives for this session, including Sarah Calvert, who's Director of Projects at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which has undertaken a lot of reports and activity in this space, as we summarized in our background document. Carla Rodriguez-Watson, who's Director of Research at the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA, also has been involved in some important recommendations around such topics as accurate race and ethnicity data in trials. Selina Wadi, who's Associate Director of Clinical Affairs at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, with many programs in this space. Megan McKenzie, Principal of Patient Inclusion and Health Equity of the Chief Diversity Office at Genentech, implementing some trials following these principles, and Silas Buchanan, founding CEO of the Institute for eHealth Equity, with a lot of opportunities for the transition to more enriched, accurate digital data to support these efforts if used right. But first, to help kick us off, I'm going to turn back to Trevin for a brief look at some findings from our team and its work to put together this meeting to help the conversation get started. Trevin?
Thanks, Mark. You can go to the next. Yeah. So I'm going to run through this quickly. Many of these, what I'm going to highlight here, have already come up in the conversations today, but we wanted to provide kind of a quick look through the relevant stakeholders and a few considerations for actions they are already or should be taking, and to kind of give our panelists a spot to jump off from. So really quickly, regulators obviously have the ongoing role we heard earlier today in setting up diversity plans for trials and assessing the content of those for thoroughness and thoughtfulness. And we look forward to seeing additional resources as we learn about these plans further to drive creation of high quality plans. And in other parts of the agency, we are hoping to continue to seeing public directed educational resources on what clinical research is, and related topics that are culturally and just linguistically considerate to some of the points raised in an earlier session. On the industry side, we hope to see our industry friends support sustainable clinical research ecosystems by sustainably investing in local and community sites and settings, and of course, developing and adhering to high quality action plans and leveraging post-market research to where it makes sense. Although, as we heard earlier, the earlier we can kind of be thinking about representation, the better, and saving it to post-market is not the ideal solution. On the funder side, obviously tying funding requirements to representative enrollment will be quite the stick incentive throughout the process. And so, and then, following up on that with checks to confirm that grantees are adhering to any kind of plan, and tying continued funding to that is one approach worth considering. Next slide. For folks like ourselves here at Duke-Margolis and some of the other speakers we've heard today, continuing to conduct research and help establish best practices on data collection and evaluation of ongoing efforts, and engaging, like we are today, the broader stakeholder community and ensuring that any findings and developments are communicated in easily digestible formats. We just heard a little bit in the previous chat on journals and their potential role. As Dr. Bibbins-Domingo said, some journals are already requiring more information from authors on demographics of studies, and we see potentially additional work that can be done by journals, again, as Dr. Bibbins-Domingo said, in coordination with some of these other stakeholders. At the health system level, we heard a lot about this in session 2 towards the development of a diverse workforce trained in clinical research principles, and the supporting of sustainable ecosystems, leveraging academic center expertise where appropriate to help bring in local and community sites that can participate at least in some clinical research paradigms, and also raising awareness and doing that real engagement we talked about to make sure participants are even aware of opportunities to present in research, and when they are, actively ask, as we heard Dr. Barrett and others talk about in session 2. And then finally, in some of our work, we've heard considerations from stakeholders around the role of IRB and related review boards in this process. And so I think at the very least, it might be interesting to explore representativeness expectations as part of an IRB review, and making sure, incorporating that into kind of whether a trial's ethical conduct, if it's not representative, and then, consider even going beyond that and more direct incorporation or collaboration with community-based review groups to ensure that the resources we are putting forward towards trials are going towards questions that matter to local communities. So again, this is just meant to be a quick overview of some of the thoughts and topics that have come out of our conversations and the work I described earlier this afternoon. But I expect Mark and the rest of our panel to dig into these and even more going forward. So Mark, I'll toss it back to you.
Thanks, Trevin, for covering a lot of ground in a little bit of time. There is obviously a lot of interest in this topic, a lot of ideas for how to move forward, but still a long way to go. And again, very glad to have our panelists with us to share their work and perspectives on how to accelerate progress, opportunities for action, and accountability. So Sarah, let me turn to you first. Sarah Calvert from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative.
Hi, thank you, Mark. I'm, as Mark mentioned, with the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is a public-private partnership between Duke and the FDA, and we develop and drive adoption of practices to increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. And one of the projects that we worked on for several years was our diversity in clinical trials project, and we spent a lot of time looking at the landscape, and this was right before the pandemic, and what was out there. And we found at that time there was a lot of work that, and you heard about this several times today, about a lot of people coming in and doing something for a particular study, but then not continuing that work, or starting over from scratch when they started a new study. So we really wanted to focus on what we could create for organizations that design and conduct clinical trials to develop that long-term strategies for deep organizational commitment. And those are grouped into recommendations that are about commitment. So making sure leadership is committed and supports and participates and is visible in those strategies to increase diversity in clinical trials, that it's ingrained within the culture of the organization, that there's partnerships, there's bidirectional community partnerships, there's partnerships with patients and patient groups, that resources are, and sustained resources, not just study level resources, are invested. So there's sufficient and sustained investments and sufficient and sustained personnel. And then a really important piece too is, the data-driven strategies, that people are using data that they have, gathering data that they don't, looking how their own organization is doing and looking at what data is out there on whatever it is that they're studying, and going back and collaborating across the ecosystem, looking at those other sources of data, and also, making adjustments according to that. And we accompanied these recommendations with a maturity model. So people, the recommendations are really like where people should be eventually, but we know that some people are starting at earlier points. So we have a 5-level maturity model for each of those areas where people can see where they could start, but also assess where they are and then go back and reassess and work towards getting to the level where they desire to be and improving their organizational level strategies.
Great, Sarah. Thanks very much. It's a very thorough and practically oriented report. I'd like to make sure we're trying to make a lot of these resources available or highlight a lot of them today in the chat and in our background paper and otherwise. I really encourage people to take a look at that one as well if they're not familiar with it already. Carla, the Reagan-Udall Foundation has some past and some very important current ongoing activities on this topic. Could you talk a little bit more from your perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Mark. And thank you to all the panels that came before me. So I think the work that we're doing at the foundation particularly informs the question of factors that industry sponsors might consider when implementing their representation goals. This is a space where real-world data can really help to generate population-based estimates of disease distribution and medical product utilization to inform appropriate recruitment targets. But in terms of diversity by race and ethnicity, this would require that race and ethnicity data are complete, unbiased, and accurate in real-world data sets, and which many of the speakers today acknowledge that they are not, which is why in our own work, looking at the real-world performance of COVID-19 diagnostics, we found that administrative claims data, which represents a major component of real-world data, have upwards of 70% missing race and ethnicity information. And that's why we launched RAISE, which is the real-world accelerator to improve the standard of collection and curation of race and ethnicity in healthcare data. And over the last year, and in a series of 11 workshops, online workshops, we got to hear from experts in the field on what they are doing to address missteps in collecting and managing race and ethnicity data throughout the healthcare data continuum. Because we knew that there were many good solutions out there, we just needed a forum to collect and share those ideas, much like was discussed in the prior panel. So I want to share 2 specific strategies with you to improve the availability of race and ethnicity data in real-world data so that we can have better recruitment targets for clinical trials. Is that all right, Mark?
Yeah, please.
Okay. But first, overall, the most important strategy, and we heard this echoed throughout today's talk, is that no matter what you do, we need to include patients and community perspective in our work. But in terms of specifics, first, the race community recognized that there continues to be a lack of transparency regarding how race and ethnicity data may be used. This may be particularly salient for populations who may be at increased risk for bias or harm when reporting these data. So there's an opportunity to be specific and intentional about why we are collecting these data in our daily clinical interactions and how they may be used and who may have access to them for specific purposes. Specific steps towards this could include being specific and intentional about why race and ethnicity are being collected, how they may be used, and who may have access to them for specific purposes. Use the intentions in the bullet above to develop messaging that can be piloted in the community and updated based on patients and member feedback. And this also lets researchers who may be using these data secondarily on appropriate ways to use those data, given the reasons for how and why those data were collected. And second, we heard a lot in RAISE about how healthcare organizations who are really grappling with right-sizing the number of race and ethnicity options that they should provide for their community and standardizing those options. So what do I mean by this? When there is too much aggregation, people don't see themselves in the options. Conversely, No one is going to search through 900 plus options to find the categories that represent them. So concrete steps towards this include establishing a clear goal of wanting to improve the collection of these data to inform existing standards and protocols, doing some research to develop a menu of race and ethnicity option responses for a given healthcare organization's catchment population. This could include holding listening sessions that inform the development and refinement of those proposed options, and developing a tool or working with a group to develop a tool to systematically and efficiently prioritize the options based on community needs. Ensuring that each option is also important to this is ensuring that each option is respectful of people and doesn't contain historical language that is harmful. Then those options should be mapped to accepted standards, including the Office of Management and Budget standards, particularly for US federal funding or submissions to federal agencies. And since the OMB is proposing a change to the federal categories of race and ethnicity, there needs to be a crosswalk from existing OMB standards to the new standard whenever it comes out. And I want to stress that given that unknown of exactly what it's going to be, it's important to do that initial shovel work to develop responses that are agnostic of any given standard. So that's a little bit of what we've been doing, and it's heartening to hear a lot of those same recommendations today, especially this idea that from the previous speaker that a lot of the solutions that are ongoing are very local. So we need to just amplify and continue pulling that thread so that we can harmonize across all these localities towards a more, high level approach.
Great. Thanks, Carla, for the high level ideas and some more practical solutions. Again, we're trying to put all this, the links to all these resources in the chat as well. Next, I'd like to turn to Selina. Maybe Selina, if you could talk about some of the experiences from the NCATS perspective on these topics.
Sure. So first, I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of the activities that we have at NCATS so that it's really put into a context that folks can understand. So I am the director for the Trial Innovation Network, which is a collaborative national network that focuses on operational innovation and operational excellence, as well as collaboration. We put together a lot of tools that are to support clinical trials, and that includes recruitment tools and patient engagement tools. We want to help make clinical trials better so that they are executed faster and they're more cost efficient. And we want to study how well these work on a national level. We've developed a lot of tools for investigators, and more information can be found at trialinnovationnetwork.org. And some of the tools that we've put together are specifically to improve the race and ethnicity makeup of our trials, including a program called Faster Together, which is an online course to help investigators think through some of these issues, just as you've been discussing. Tools that also improve the ability to do decentralized trials as well. And so there are a lot of mechanisms that are important, a lot of tools that can be important within an individual investigator's trials. Of course, recruitment is the big challenge and the big cost of many of our trials, and we certainly don't want them to fail for ethical reasons, but also scientific reasons. I think that we have a real opportunity to work more with community members and in an engaged way in order to determine how we can make it easier for patients and participants to be part of our trials. Right now, it's very difficult, and we are having decreasing number of people come into our trials. And unless we make it easier we're going to see that trend continue. And so we just started 2 weeks ago, 10, which is Trial Innovation Network 2.0, and we'll be developing even more tools. And there's a real focus of expanding so that we are including more voices, and not only voices of race, ethnic, minorities, women, older populations, but also institutions that are within these within these communities, including HBCUs, MSIs, and rural networks.
Great. Well, Selena, thanks for all that, both past activities and some of the new activities that you're just describing, the 10 2.0 tools as well. Good to see that more is coming there as well. Megan, can I turn to you next?
Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for staying for the afternoon for all of us. It's just my honor to be here in this panel, and honestly gives me great hope for the momentum that we are creating and keeping toward improving health equity. I work with Genentech in the Chief Diversity Office for the last 3.5 years in patient inclusion and health equity. And it's been a journey to come here, and I am still learning. I started working in clinical research 25 years ago, working at the site with patients who remain my true heroes. Never doubt how even one patient's story can change behavior. And I've seen it over and over for our protocol teams, and I'd love to share those stories later. But after working in clinical trials, running trials and then programs and initiatives and patient centricity, I was interviewing, we all have a moment in time where we're like, we're going to do this full time. Interviewing 2 women who were triple negative breast cancer survivors, Renetta and Karen. These are 2 Black women who talked about the struggle to either get to a trial or the struggle to have their general oncologist help them find a trial. And after seeing tumors melt on a CT scan in a phase 1 trial, you want to be a part to make sure everybody has access to information to make a decision that's right for them. And I'm just so honored to be a part of a group that believes diversity and inclusion is everybody's business. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take like 1 minute to tell you what Genentech, I hope, is doing differently, or maybe every pharma is doing this, which I applaud and stand up. First of all, I love the mandating of the diversity plans. Just let me stand up and say that. But we've been focused on advancing inclusive research for a long time. I mentioned our work concerns about reaching Black women in triple negative breast cancer trials. Our patient advocacy group, previously led by Quita Highsmith, who's now our Chief Diversity Officer, stood up and said, how are we reaching our Black women in triple negative breast cancer trials? She and a lead scientist in PD stood up and formed an Advancing Inclusive Research initiative, and we wanted to get outside of the pharma biotech bubble. And in 2017, formed an alliance with these external council for inclusive research members. These are researchers, clinicians, and advocates who really helped us be bolder in approaches to better reach our underrepresented populations in clinical trials. And our CEO, so I'm going to say this because I think it's important that we continue to partner with HR, but our CEO allowed us to form a separate organization in the company that reported directly to him, Alexander Hardy, so that all the officers had the ladder up action plans within the pillars for diversity and inclusion that we created across the enterprise. And those pillars are foster belonging for our people, where we have transparent commitments to double Black and Latino representation in the director to C-suite level by 2025. This includes unconscious bias mandated training, inclusive research bias trainings, fellowships with HBCUs. We have development programs for our Black and Latino populations. And then the second pillar is advancing inclusive research and health equity, where we formed relationships with sites through an Advancing Inclusive Research Site Alliance. And these are sites who know very well how to reach their communities of color in Texas, in Tennessee, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Alabama, in California, because we know we have to do better. And even though we've been trying, representation year over year industry-wide is not improving. So they're really helping us cultivate best practices and share those, like creating HCP AIR training on unconscious bias, being very transparent about past transgressions, and patient education. And I've heard several times local. One of the things the Chief Diversity Office has done is create a fund for regional health equity symposia. And so through proposals, we sponsor institutions that bring community leaders, faith-based leaders, patients, physicians, policymakers together to understand locally what the barriers are for patients to have access to meds or diagnostics in clinical trials, and how to form solutions. So knowing that we need to tackle things. It's different in Texas versus Alabama versus Tennessee versus California. So understanding those barriers. And our last commitment or pillar that officers and managers and our people are leaning into is Transform Society, which is a commitment to our community. And I know most pharma have giving funds, but being very intentional with giving. So an example would be creating a health equity innovation fund. And last year, our giving partners for 94% of the grantees that got about 20 million in total, 94% were to leaders of color or co-leaders of color. 84% of the grantees were grantees who had not received a grant from us before. So trying to shake it up a bit and making sure we're righting past wrongs and being very intentional in our focus, and then working, of course, to mandate diversity plans, which I can talk about later in our other questions. But just, I am very thankful to be here. I'm very thankful that we're talking about this. I think we will help keep the momentum. And I see a sea change of people that are committed to advancing inclusive research, and happy to stop talking now, Mark, so others can talk.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, Meg. You certainly covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate your optimism and enthusiasm too. Next, I'd like to go to Silas with the Institute for eHealth Equity. Silas, what's your perspective on this? A lot of people are hoping that eHealth can help and not harm.
That is the hope, and I'm honored to be here as well. Esteemed panel, and just a great day altogether. So I'm Silas Buchanan. I'm with the Institute for eHealth Equity. As the name infers, eHealth Equity, we're concerned, frankly, about an exacerbation of health disparities because of technology, right? So it's critically important, and we've spent quite a bit of time working with underserved communities and communities of color, raising their literacy around the benefits of adopting and utilizing technology to improve health outcomes for them as individuals, right? As we start driving everything from AI to remote patient monitoring tools and devices, tools, trackers, apps, and devices, they've got to be spun up in culturally appropriate ways. So it's important that we not only work with them to raise their literacy around the use of tech tools for themselves as individuals, families, communities writ large. It's also important on the other side of that coin that we do work with the ideators, the innovators of health tech solutions to assure that they're spinning things up in culturally appropriate ways. However, these days we do a lot less consulting in these spaces. We've been tasked and funded by Morehouse School of Medicine to actually build some things now, right? And what we've been tasked with building, and we're intent on building, I think is germane to this discussion I heard earlier, and perhaps to our discussion that's coming up. We're building ecosystems designed to put and keep the leaders of faith and community-based organizations together. Let's put them together and keep them together, shortening the distance between them and other faith and community-based organizations, right? Too many times, we want a series of best practices to emerge. And like too many times we'll see, oh, I live in Cleveland, right? And so the infant mortality rate here rivals Jackson, Mississippi, which rivals a third world country. But we do it poorly here in terms of engaging community to address that issue. Who does it well? Well, Boston does it well, and Baltimore does it well. And so at one point, the leaders here in Cleveland decided to fly the leaders from Baltimore into Cleveland for some discussion. We can learn from them. What are they doing? Well, half the people that should have been in the room that day weren't invited. The other half that were in the room have long since forgot what was discussed, right? There should be an ecosystem, right, where we are putting folks together and keeping them together so a series of best practices begins to emerge. So that's one. The other thing we want to do is shorten the distance between these faith and community-based leaders that are known, like, loved, and historically trusted in their communities, right? Let's shorten the distance between them and the community members that they serve. And lastly, the CBOs, and maybe both those stakeholder groups will say, and healthcare stakeholders, payer, provider, academic, life science, and pharma stakeholders. So we're standing up two things because we desire to work both secularly and non-secularly, and it's important that we do this because culture is critically important. And when you want to engage with underserved communities, specifically communities of color, understanding culture is important, right? Faith-based organizations, they have their own culture. So you've got to understand that, right? It's just the same as barber, beautician, nail tech, corner stores. When I'm in the barbershop, you can tell I don't go so much anymore, but there's a culture that exists there. And so plugging into that is important. So ourhealthministry.com is one of those platforms that we've been tasked with standing up. The other is ourhealthycommunity.com. Again, barber, beautician, nail tech, corner store. How do we engage kind of both sides of these folks and put them in places and keep them there? I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't share one more thing. We were funded not too terribly long ago by NIH through the network of the National Library of Medicine to better understand underserved community trepidation around participating in clinical research. So we partnered with Health Literacy Media out in St. Louis, and we spun up what we have now branded the Research Literacy and Justice Project. We just finished the report, and I'm happy to send that out to anybody who requests it. Okay. And, it's trepidation around participating in clinical research, Tuskegee aside, we're all familiar with that. But what other trepidations do we have? Why do we have them? And what might, change our minds on some level? So we got really clear understanding around community leaders, maybe translating for some community members, perceptions around health research and clinical trials, barriers that might affect participation, and feedback, just general feedback on why folks are pushing back. We recently received some add-on funding from large pharma, so we'll continue this work in New Orleans and then likely Chicago or Cleveland. But I'll stop there and throw it back to you, Mark, and we can get underway with some chat.
Yeah, thanks, Silas. We're definitely going to come back to these community engagement issues and, as you said, building a new kind of ecosystem. We do have some discussion questions to help us help guide this that we've circulated ahead of time, and I'm going to flash those up for a minute. They're in the background document and the agenda for this meeting, and so I want to put everybody's face back up on the screen in just a moment. But we're going to start with a question of industry considerations for implementing, I guess, more stringent, maybe you say more effective policies for representative enrollment. And we've had a lot of discussion today around diversity plans, so requirements, and seems like near universal, at least from our participants today, support for their implementation. Is that enough? There are a lot of different things and approaches might go into a diversity plan, reflecting perhaps appropriately the differences in the conditions being studied, the populations being studied, the circumstances of the clinical research. But also we heard a lot of discussion about the need for metrics and measurable progress. And I'd like to get views from the group on how we can move forward on these issues faster to get to truly effective diversity policies, ones that are delivering the results. You heard from Dr. Bibbins-Domingo about how some journals are now requiring publication of the diversity of the trial participants and comparing that against the diversity or burden of the conditions involved. Or there are other steps like that. And Megan, I don't want to pick on you, but since you are involved in actually implementing some of these kinds of considerations in your diversity plan as part of the diversity plan requirements, maybe you could get your kind of frontline perspective.
Yeah, pick on me, Mark. Pick on me, Mark.
Yeah.
I don't mind. I don't mind at all. No, I think I heard an earlier speaker talk about the measure what you treasure, right? So one of the things that we first done is develop a clinical trial diversity dashboard. So anyone in the company, and we quarterly send this to our late stage portfolio committee and our leaders so they can see where we are. Think about creating a report card, a red, yellow, green. We all have this for meeting our milestones like first patient in, last patient in, data readout, launch, make it part of your roadmap. So there's a red, yellow, green as you go. And of course, we should be planning about this way ahead. I am a big fan of diversity plans. I have seen, and I do think what the FDA is doing now is terrific. When you hear, you might not get accelerated approval if you don't have representation in your clinical trial, let me tell you, everybody stands up and says, how are we going to get better at representation in clinical trials? So I don't mind the stick. I think it helps people focus and be intentional. Another thing we're doing is, we do have mandates from our late stage portfolio committee. We are trying to understand that data that has gaps. Sometimes it's working through, oncology, it's a little better. We have registries, but even then you have folks that don't report race or may say unknown or it's missing, but you still have to measure against something. And whenever you have to start and choose those enrollment goals. And I will say, even years ago, it was like 8 years ago, we were trying to come up with demographic goals in a NASH program. There's no NASH registries. So you work with your physician, your statistician, and you're like, well, you have to do proxy by obesity. So there are things you can do. You just have to start doing them now. I will just say and then I'll give it up to others, 4 Ps that I think are really important to focus on in diversity plans. First, what are we doing for our physicians and staff to make protocol burden less burdensome, to help them lean into discussions around unconscious bias, ensuring every potential patient who may be eligible is asked, and helping to create a system where they can see what clinical trials are available. The second P is patients and caregivers and families. I heard a lot about listening, ensuring you have a patient voice involved from the beginning, from your steering committee to your protocol review to your councils. And then protocol burden. Tufts University's done tons of research on this. We have gotten more and more complicated over the last 15 years. We have, in the effort to launch a drug faster, we are merging phase 1, 2, 3, 4 trials. So it's additive and having more visit burden. And also the safety information is learned in compressed manner. So it means it's more burdensome for patients, more burdensome for physicians. So how are we working to widen the entry criteria and reduce the burden in our protocols? And the fourth is policy. So, looking at Medicaid expansion in every state, looking at the Child Poverty Act. This is not my field. This is my federal government affairs, but looking at translational and phone telemedicine. And then there's so much more, but I would say collecting the data and doing piloted work for sexual orientation, gender identity data as well. We haven't talked as much about marginalized minorities like LGBTQ. So really pushing boundaries and being bold and helping to share those best practices across. I hope that helps. I didn't give you specifics. I'm happy to lean into examples later, but I want to make sure other panelists have a chance to talk.
That's great. And I do want to open up to others. Maybe Sarah could go to you next. We've highlighted the work that the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative has done on sort of trial network and trial capability maturity. Does that work have some metrics or guideposts that would be useful for helping to ensure that diversity plans really are learning from each other, really are effective in achieving their goals?
I think so. I think, and I was going to, you can tell we had members from Genentech Roche who were on our project team because a lot of our maturity model sounds like the things that they are doing. So I definitely second all those things, knowing where you are, having dashboards, all of that. But it's also critical when you're implementing these and actually when you're building those to make sure that the people carrying out the study are actually able to do what you're planning. So making sure that you're interacting with sites, making sure that you're interacting with your communities and your patient groups to be sure. And if once you, and then again, collect the data, see how you're doing, go back and look and see, did you achieve those goals? Why didn't you? Do you need to expand your networks? Do you, all of those things have the possibility, but it's really important that you're collecting that data and then making improvements where needed.
Great, thanks. And we'd like to ask others suggestions that you have for speeding progress on the effectiveness of diversity plans in clinical trials.
Well, of course, I would say you absolutely have to start by engaging community members, right? And perhaps ideally through those community-facing organizations that they know, like, love, and trust. And the work that we do, it really always begins with just a handful of things. Acknowledging the history of marginalization and mistrust around clinical research and communities, right? 1. 2, let's have some transparent discussions about power and where it really lies with community, and let's hear their feedback on that. 3, we always try and discuss, how do we build on existing community strengths and leverage local knowledge? There is so much talent, there's so much knowledge, there's so much skill embedded in community. How do we get at that? How do we improve, right? Use that to improve capacity building with local support. And lastly, how do we identify and encourage opportunities for co-learning? Because the community members, and I think someone, maybe it was Nadine or Yasmin said this earlier, it's not always, the onus is not always on community members to become smarter, to become more literate, right? The onus is also on researchers to become more culturally competent, right? And they need to take that task very seriously. And that's my 2 cents.
So those are great comments. They actually lead right into the next couple of discussion questions we had, and I would encourage the rest of the panel as we go through the rest of these discussion questions, specific additional recommendations that you all have to help accelerate progress. We've talked a bit about industry steps in design. I want to come back to some of those, but the second question on steps that researchers, industry, and broader stakeholder groups can take to acknowledge practices that discourage representative and diverse trial participation, and for organizations, sponsors, researchers that don't currently have established relationships. What else can we do? So Silas laid out some important considerations here. So let me open up this topic to the rest of the group. I would say too, I'm just looking at some of the questions that have come in. One theme is trust. And Silas, I don't want to paraphrase you, but your emphasis on awareness of issues from the community and individuals in those communities' perspective, and being able to work through organizations that have already earned trust. Both of those things are really important in making progress here. But I'd like to hear other perspectives from the group on these important and related topics.
I'm happy to start briefly, but I mean, you can't come into a relationship and then leave when your drug doesn't work, right? You need sustained patient advocacy partnerships. And I think one of the commitments is to be a part of the solution for access for screening. So bringing education and screening into communities that may not have that readily available through health fairs, fiesta fairs, broad campaigns that might or might not be in your portfolio, but that communities need, is a good start to helping to build trust and going where the patients are. And Dr. Buchanan, at your talk about faith-based organizations, the importance of that, who have trusted community members. One of the ecosystem-led activities was Montefiore specifically had a desire to bring in faith-based and community-based leaders to be able to talk more about the importance of COVID vaccines. This was at the peak of COVID, and also clinical trials were something that were really important for them to understand. They brought in those community-based and faith-based organizations to bring in speakers to educate around the environment, which was actively changing. So being willing to be a part of those discussions, take the heat, because people are really worried about the cost of drugs. Like, why is it so expensive? You have to lean into these conversations and be a part of helping people through screening. So I would say if you don't have an existing patient advocacy relationships, it starts with listening and understanding what their barriers are and concerns, and perhaps helping to co-create education and help lift those screening efforts. That's one way to start.
Real quick, Megan, I'm just Silas. My wife is Dr. Buchanan. I'm just Silas.
Oh, I like that. I like it. Okay, so I'll say Silas, and we'll talk about your wife later.
Thanks, Silas. Carlos, Selina, I know you all developed a lot of resources that seem relevant to at least addressing some of these historic and current challenges. Anything that you all like to add on these topics?
Go ahead, Sarah.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on what Silas had said. Hi, Silas. It was great to see you again. And again, we heard this throughout our RAISE workshops. It's so important to really engage community and helping to, so that relationship is bi-directional, and baking that into your development process, and understand and making sure that, the definitions of health equity are those of the community as well as the systems that are trying to collect information. And again, if that information is not present in our population-based data sets, or if there is no registry, as Megan kind of alluded to, we need to improve that data. I think other speakers talked about there are some things even beyond the clinical trial space that really inform our conception of how to adequately target these trials. And so, again, important to consider these where the data are and what state those are for us to generate kind of population-based estimates of disease distribution.
Great, thanks, Selena.
Yeah, I think that it's a bit challenging because the people who are working on building trust and working long-term in the community, they may or may not be the same people who are running the trial or the face of the trial. And so how do you really coordinate those two activities in a meaningful way? Number one. The second piece of it is that the use of community advisory boards, and it just so happened I was talking to somebody at Duke about this earlier in the week, of what we are asking of our community advisory boards for some of the trials isn't entirely clear. They may be there, but they're not as much part of the conversation, or what types of questions would really be appropriate to discuss, what types of issues would be appropriate to discuss with them. So, for example, if you spend time in conversations on FDA policy, that may not be the best way to work with your community advisory committee unless it's going to inform it in some ways, such as inclusion or whatnot. And so being very clear of what types of things it's most helpful to work with your community advisory board and be sure that you're getting that information. And I completely agree with some things that Silas said, which were along the lines of you need to work with them early and often and continuously throughout the process. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, this is a great discussion. I'm just trying to be mindful of the clock. We don't have too much of your time left with us, and I want to get to the last couple of topics. The fourth question has already come up in terms of developing new sites. As I think Sina just said, people who are have put in the effort to understand community and build trust long term are quite different from those who are coming in for trials, particularly individual trials that are being done for the first time. Does that mean we need to move towards some more systematic engagement with communities? And how do we reconcile that with the fact that trials are done have been done often on a one-off basis? So I'm trying to connect back to some of the discussion we had earlier around the importance of platforms or study ecosystems in communities, so you're not sort of having to reinvent the wheel and reinvent trust every time.
So I think
Any
that
thoughts?
as we that's one of the benefits of the CTSA program, which sits within NCATS, is you have this long-standing group that can do clinical trials, and they can be selected, maybe not for all of the sites in a clinical trial, but some of those sites. And so, for example, in New York, you have several CTSAs, and if they have this ongoing relationship with the communities, then when the trials come in, it's not as disruptive, and you basically have a guide to guide you through the various processes. And so there's one component that the clinical trials starting and stopping that can be very disruptive to trying to build this within a community, but that's in part, you have to accept some of that. But there can be this underlying group of people and teams that are always there.
Other thoughts, maybe Megan, from your standpoint? You all have individual products, not an enormous number of them, and trials and often multiple trials that relate to those individual products that you're, as you said, you're trying to make more integrated. How do you see keeping this kind of ongoing presence and trust in communities?
Yeah, you mentioned platform trials, so that made me think about, we have several basket trials where we were able to maintain a longer study because it's got multiple arms trying to read. This is oncology studies, or my tactic trial was one of them where we brought in 60 community centers. And so I do see models that are working to reach more community centers. I'm the infrastructure build to do a trial is real. It's really a big administrative burden. There's also some of us partnering with ACCC, or this is a community center oncology organization trying to do heat maps to find community centers who we could help build infrastructure. And this is an issue outside the US as well, right? So, but part of that's forming these relationships with sites beyond, above therapeutic area level, above a study level. That's part of the alliances that we're forming. So the Advancing Inclusive Research Site Alliance to help us think much more above a product level. So co-creating education and building enhanced patient support services and patient navigation, which they say are key for reaching and retaining our communities in clinical trials. So I think these alliances and partnerships that you may not, I have to say, I was at National Minority Quality Forum, and one of the women who won an award, she for Best 30 Under 30, created shop docs. So I don't know if you've heard of this, but she started in a barbershop, and she has volunteers from physicians in the surrounding community to come and do health checks, and kids and the families get free haircuts while they're doing this. They get clinical advice, and she's expanding it to 7. I would love to work with her more. So if she's listening, I would love to work with her more. I think we need to work differently than we are now to work with community. But that's platform that made me triggered. Yale also has something they're starting that's really good with referrals from 13 community centers around. And one of our earlier questions was around reimbursement, and this seems to be a sticky wicket for some folks, because for decades we were told never offer reimbursement for time in a clinical trial for your oncology patients because they're vulnerable. And today we find out oncology patients who can't afford to be in a trial aren't in the trial. So we've completely flipped. For 7 years, HSS, or Copernicus IRB, ASCO are all saying we should be reimbursing patients for their time. You all know stories of where people can either afford the gas to get to a trial or food. It is real. It's a real issue. And I think we need to make that much easier to reimburse patients. It shouldn't count against their disability. I mean, optimally, I would say it shouldn't be taxed because it limits how much we're able to reimburse them. And this is time away from their families, time away from other trials or treatments. So I have a lot to say there, Mark, but yeah, I think we have a ways to go because the administrative burden for standing up a trial is so high. So we need to look at that as well.
Yeah, and the discussions about payment for participation in trials, that's something that had a lot of good back and forth in our previous session. Wish we had more time for it now. Very important topic where, as you said, the process and the views of optimal policies have been evolving. I want to stick with platforms for a minute, and Sarah, maybe go to you. And in full disclosure, I do a lot of work with cities, so I know the topic that the topic of platforms is one that city has thought about. One way to build infrastructure and community, as we heard from Selena, is through clinical trial networks that extend out and stay there. Another, as we've heard from Silas and others, is connect to the community organizations and build infrastructure around that. The barbershops, the preachers, the other community leaders, and giving them networks to connect into these trials and activities. Another way could be, and this gets to a question from Elisa Hewley in the Q&A around, are we really engaging the local healthcare providers as much as we could be? So federally qualified health centers disproportionately serve some of these traditionally underserved communities in terms of access to primary care and ongoing care for patients. Historically, a lot of these frontline clinical organizations haven't been involved in trials. Maybe it's cost, maybe it's time, maybe it's resources. Sarah, go to you. I know the city's done a lot of work around how to address regulatory burdens and steps that might create barriers to more broad and representative participation by local trusted healthcare providers in clinical trials. Could you say a bit about that work and its relevance here?
Sure. Yeah, we have a project that just released recommendations last December. It's called Trials in Clinical Practice. So and we work a lot with the Duke-Margolis with your trials at the point of care. So I think that's one potential way to increase the populations that participate in trials and that was mentioned several times earlier today, like making sure people know about research when they're getting care. So you don't have to find people to participate in research. You can ask people if they want to participate in research within the setting of their routine care. But that also includes making sure that you're not just limiting to the academic medical centers where you think research is mostly being done, but that also needs to happen at other centers that might not typically do research. So you have to look at what's needed for training for staff there. What kind of support can you give to them so you're not disrupting the care that's happening, but you're actually providing the support that's needed so that they can participate in the research as well.
And certainly some important things for academic centers to do in terms of rigorous collection, especially early on and with understanding a new product. But as we get to more widespread use, certainly a lot of different kinds of practice settings that do face cost constraints, administrative and limitations on taking on administrative burdens and very busy clinical practices. So I appreciate that city work. And Carly, you've got your hand up. I know you all have been working on this topic as well.
You should know that, Mark. Yes, we've been hosting a series of convenings on evidence generation. And I think piggybacking off of what Sarah just said, really trying to address workforce burden, and particularly for those frontline clinicians, make that lift a little bit lighter for them by really engaging on some of the electronic health record information that can help target patients that might be, eligible for certain trials, how to scrape some of the information that might be in the electronic health record to decrease burden of surveys and follow-up that might be needed. I think all of that has been discussed as tools to address this issue of workforce burden. But again, that means, and I'm going to beat the drum again, that we have to improve the accessibility of those data in those real-world clinical data sets.
Right. And I know there's more we could discuss on all of these topics. We are almost out of time. I'd like to open this back up to each of our panelists for maybe a final comment on there an important topic or idea that we haven't discussed enough yet today that could help accelerate progress, meaning get us to a change in culture around diversity and participation in clinical trials, the expectation that is what should and does happen, the infrastructure needed to support it and ways to do it that don't add even more to cost of clinical trials, that can leverage some of the ideas we've discussed around engaging providers in new ways, using electronic data, using community resources more effectively. We've heard a lot of good reasons for belief that there can be further progress, maybe even accelerating progress on these challenges, but still some hard work ahead. So any final words, if you all keep it just to a few seconds on what to do next as we wrap up this session. And Selena, I see you first. Maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I raised my hand for a different reason, but I will go ahead now.
Okay, well, you can work that in too.
Well, I think that AI and machine learning offers a really offers an opportunity to solve some of these problems that are very time consuming, such as finding patients, identifying patients, screening through inclusion, exclusion criteria, making some initial communications with physicians and keeping physicians up to date in terms of what's going on within the conduct of the trial. And so not using it to take over the trial, but using it really to augment some of the things that we're doing so that you don't have to have as many personnel. And so that's definitely one of the things that I have an interest within my group of working on, but we want to be sure it's available to a wide swath of people.
Great. Thanks, Selena. Silas, final thought?
I don't know. This is just a big, hairy problem, and we'll have we need much more time. And I don't know, I'll try and be super brief. So I sat in a room with 20 CEOs of rare diseases, and they each have their own, right? DEI initiative, and they want to get at, everybody is trying to get at communities, and it can just be overbearing on the community side. And so just a bit of caution there. Trust, of course, we've heard a lot about that. We've talked a little bit maybe about social determinants of health today and addressing those things. We did not talk about the connections to political determinants of health, which drive social determinants of health many times, something else to be considered. And so I'm optimistic and cautious at the same time, and look forward to the next discussion.
Thanks so much, Silas. Sarah?
Yeah, I will agree with everything that's been said. And I think second that's collaboration and coordination is what we need. There's so much work in this space. There is a lot of experts out there, so nobody should be starting from scratch, and no one should be cold calling people without checking for whoever already has those relationships with communities. So I think that it really takes all of us working together to make a difference. And I'll plug that City is working with several organizations in our convergence work to try to do some of those things. What is all the work? How can everybody work together? How can we achieve the goals that everybody has? And we'll have, and that's MRCT and National Academies and Faster Cures in City. And we had our first meeting, and we're going to be continuing to meeting. So if you're interested in that, people can reach out to me. And there's lots of people on this meeting today that are part of that. So we're excited to figure out what we can all do together to achieve more representative clinical trials.
Great. And then I know we're about at time, but Megan and then Carl, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'll double up on what Sarah said about sharing best practices. This should be a very non-competitive space. We do have a long way to go. I will relay, be bolder. We have some USMA partners who've been very bold, and they've done standalone trials in phase 4 mandating not all comers, but enrolling only Black and Brown populations in our ocrelizumab MS trial, which we've learned from, are carrying forward to the DME trial with Vabysmo. It's enrolling Black, Latino, and Native American Indigenous communities. And now with Katori, with listening and observational trials with Native American Indigenous communities. And by pushing boundaries where we have safety for our drugs, it's allowing us to find new community centers. It's allowing us to understand better and build cultural humility. So be bold, like do some mandated protocols where you have missing data gaps for reaching our Black, Brown, and underrepresented communities. That's probably where I go. And then
great, thanks. And last but certainly not least, Carla.
Thank you. I mean, I couldn't agree more with the comments so far, and engaging communities to develop solutions, but making sure that there is really, truly shared risk and benefit to these activities, making sure that our outcomes that we're trying to achieve are aligned with the community's goals in terms of health, and being able to actually participate in those trials and not building off the back of people of color. A lot focused on, I think, thinking a lot about Indigenous communities too, that we're being inclusive in what we hope to extract from those populations and being able to give back. And again, as so many people have said here, to be using AI and to be trying to leverage electronic data, we need to make sure and help bolster that those data are available, are complete, are unbiased, and are accurate.
Thanks very much to you, Carla, and to all of our panelists in this session. We are wrapping up the event now. I wish we had more time, some of you all said as well. But on the other hand, these are urgent issues to address. And as you've heard today, there are more opportunities, better understanding, more initiatives underway than ever to address them. We still have a long way to go. But because of the discussions today and because of all the kind of ongoing work that we are trying to facilitate and that all of you are undertaking, I feel like we can make some further progress. So for now, I'd like to thank everyone, our speakers, our attendees, many of you who asked questions and included comments, for your participation today, and especially for your ongoing efforts to address the critical challenges that we've discussed today. We were very fortunate to have such a great group of experts and a diverse range of perspectives with us. We know that there are more that still need to be included more effectively, and we intend to do that in our further work. Also want to give a special thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their support for this effort, and a special thanks to the Duke Margolis team, Trevin Locke, Sandra Yanka, Kaylee Probst, Becky Ray, Marianne Hamilton Lopez, Andrea Toomey, Luke DeRocher, and Hannah Vitiello for all of their efforts to put this work together, and in advance for the continued efforts underway at Duke Margolis on this topic. Thank you for joining us. Please stay connected with us for further work on these and other related topics to get to a much more inclusive, effective healthcare system and the kind of clinical trials that are needed to achieve that. Take care and have a great rest of the afternoon.